Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The shadows in my peripheral vision moved wrong. That was the first thing I noticed when I stepped into the cabin, my footsteps echoing against weathered floorboards that had seen decades of mountain winters. The real estate agent had warned me about the isolation. No cell service, no neighbors for miles, just the endless pine forest stretching toward jagged peaks that scraped the belly of perpetually gray clouds. What she hadn't mentioned was how my own shadow seemed to lag behind my movements, like it was walking through invisible molasses while I moved through air. I convinced myself it was exhaustion. The drive up the winding mountain road had taken 8 hours, my nerves frayed by hairpin turns and the constant sensation that something massive was watching from between the trees. Moving boxes from the truck to the cabin had left my muscles burning and my mind sluggish. Shadows playing tricks was just fatigue, nothing more. The cabin felt older than its listed age of 60 years. Pine walls had darkened to the color of dried blood, and every surface bore the patina of decades spent breathing mountain air thick with moisture and secrets. Previous tenants had left behind scattered belongings, a coffee mug with a chipped handle, a wool blanket that smelled like smoke and something else I couldn't identify, a stack of books whose pages had yellowed to the color of bone. As evening crept across the forest, I unpacked by the light of a single lamp that cast harsh angles across the main room. My shadow stretched across the opposite wall, dark and familiar. But when I raised my hand to scratch my neck, the shadow's movement came a half-second too late, like it was following a delayed transmission of my actions. My pulse quickened. I dropped my hand and watched the shadow do the same, but again with that subtle lag. The rational part of my brain offered explanations. Poor lighting, old electrical wiring causing the bulb to flicker imperceptibly, the altitude affecting my perception. But my body knew something was wrong. Sweat gathered at the base of my skull despite the cabin's chill. I forced myself to continue unpacking, keeping my movements deliberate and slow, watching the shadow from the corner of my eye. Sometimes it matched my pace perfectly. Other times it seemed to hesitate, as if considering whether to obey. That first night I woke to whispers. The sounds drifted through the cabin walls like smoke, too faint to understand but too distinct to ignore. My mouth went dry as I strained to listen, every nerve-ending firing signals of danger to a brain that desperately wanted to rationalize what couldn't be rationalized. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The walls, the ceiling, the space beneath the floorboards. I fumbled for the lamp, my fingers clumsy with panic. Light flooded the room and the whispers stopped as if someone had pressed a mute button. But my shadow on the wall wasn't alone anymore. Other shadows clustered around it, shapeless, dark forms that had no corresponding objects to cast them. My heart hammered against my ribs like something trapped and desperate to escape. I spun around, searching for the sources of those impossible shadows, but the room was empty except for my scattered belongings and the smell of fierce sweat now pouring from my skin. When I turned back to the wall, the extra shadows were gone. Only mine remained, and it was perfectly in sync with my movements. Sleep didn't come again that night. I sat in the chair by the window, watching the forest beyond the glass. The trees stood motionless in the still air, their branches reaching toward the cabin like gnarled fingers, but shadows moved between the trunks. Not the soft, shifting darkness of wind-blown leaves, but purposeful shapes that seemed to patrol the perimeter of my new home. By morning, my hands shook when I tried to make coffee. The whispers returned as soon as darkness fell the next day, clearer now, almost conversational. They spoke of things buried deep in the mountain soil, of promises made and broken, of freedoms that had been denied for too long. The words felt familiar, as if I'd heard them in dreams I couldn't quite remember. My shadow began to move independently during the day, shifting positions when I wasn't looking directly at it. I would catch glimpses of it gesturing when my hands were still, turning its head when mine faced forward. The sight sent waves of nausea through my stomach and made my skin crawl like it was covered in insects. On the third night, the whispers became urgent. They told me about the source, something ancient that slumbered in the deepest part of the forest, something that had been drawing shadows to itself for generations, collecting them like a miser hoarding coins. The whispers insisted that I was the key, that I could release them from their bondage if I was brave enough to venture into the woods. I refused, clinging to the last threads of rationality. But my shadow began to rebel. It would disappear entirely for hours at a time, leaving me standing in lamplight without the dark companion that had followed me my entire life. During those shadowless periods, I felt naked, exposed, like part of my soul had been torn away. When the shadow returned, it brought others. They clustered on the walls around me, stretching and reaching, their movements becoming more frantic with each passing hour. The whispers grew into a constant murmur, overlapping voices that spoke of freedom and revenge, and the sweet taste of moonlight on skin that hadn't felt its touch in decades. My throat became permanently parched, my breathing shallow and rapid. Every sound made me jump. The settling of old wood, the rustle of something moving outside the windows, the creak of floorboards under feet that might not have been mine. Paranoia wrapped around my thoughts like barbed wire, convincing me that the forest itself was alive and watching, waiting for me to make the choice that would either save or damn us all. On the fourth night, I couldn't stand it anymore. The whispers had become screams, and my shadow was writhing on the wall like it was in agony. The sight of its torment sent sympathetic pain shooting through my chest. Whatever was happening, I had to end it. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the forest. The trees closed around me like a living tunnel, their branches knitting together overhead to block out most of the star-scattered sky. My flashlight beam carved a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating moss-covered trunks and the occasional glint of eyes that belonged to creatures I couldn't name. The whispers guided me deeper, their voices now coming from my own mouth without my permission. My lips moved, forming words in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. The language of shadows, of things that existed in the spaces between light and dark. The forest floor began to slope downward, leading me into a valley I hadn't seen on any map. Here, the trees grew differently, twisted into impossible shapes, their bark black as charcoal, their leaves rustling with sounds like distant weeping. The air grew thick and hard to breathe, pressing against my lungs like water. At the valley's heart stood something that might once have been a tree. Its trunk was easily 20 feet across, but instead of bark, its surface looked like polished obsidian. No branches grew from its sides, just a smooth column that disappeared into the canopy above. But shadows covered every inch of its surface, thousands of them, writhing and overlapping in a constant dance of silent agony. My own shadow leaped from my feet and joined the mass, merging with the others in what looked like a reunion between long-lost family members. I staggered, feeling the loss like a physical blow to my chest. Without my shadow, I felt incomplete, vulnerable in ways I'd never imagined possible. The tree pulsed with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. As I approached, I could see that the shadows weren't just covering its surface. They were trapped within it, pressed between layers of that obsidian bark like insects in amber. Some were human-shaped, others belonged to animals or things that had never drawn breath. All of them were reaching toward me with desperate, grasping motions. Understanding hit me like a physical blow. This thing had been collecting shadows for centuries, maybe millennia. Every person or creature that had wandered too close to this valley had lost their dark companion to this ancient collector, and now it wanted mine permanently. But the whispers had lied about one thing. I wasn't the key to their freedom. I was meant to be the final piece of whatever dark puzzle this entity was assembling. My shadow had been marked from the moment I'd set foot in the cabin, drawn here by forces I couldn't comprehend. The tree's pulse quickened, and cracks began to appear in its obsidian surface. The trapped shadows pressed against these fissures, their silent screams visible in the desperate way they clawed at their prison. My own shadow was among them now, its familiar shape barely distinguishable from the rest. I knew what I had to do, even as every instinct screamed at me to run. The flashlight felt heavy in my hands as I raised it like a weapon. The entity had spent so long in darkness that it had forgotten the power of direct, concentrated light. I switched the flashlight to its highest setting and aimed the beam directly at the largest crack in the tree's surface. The light hit the obsidian and refracted, splitting into dozens of smaller beams that found every fissure and weakness. The tree shuddered, and the sound it made was like breaking glass mixed with dying screams. More cracks appeared, spreading across the surface like a spiderweb. The trapped shadows began pouring out through the gaps, their forms solid and real in the flashlight's glare. They looked at me with expressions of gratitude and terror, before fleeing into the forest, finally free after their long imprisonment. My own shadow was among the last to escape. As it peeled away from the crumbling tree, it turned back toward me, and for a moment I could swear I saw my own face looking back with an expression of profound relief. The obsidian tree collapsed in on itself with a sound like thunder, leaving nothing but a pile of ordinary rocks and dirt. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, and I could breathe freely for the first time since arriving at the cabin. My shadow rejoined me as I walked back through the forest, falling into perfect synchronization with my movements. The whispers were gone, replaced by the normal sounds of a mountain night: owls calling, small animals rustling through undergrowth, the distant murmur of wind through pine needles. But as I reached the cabin, I noticed something that made my blood run cold again. The shadows of the trees around my home were moving wrong, swaying in patterns that didn't match the wind. And in their dark movements, I could see shapes that looked almost human, shapes that seemed to be watching me with a mixture of gratitude and hunger. I had freed the trapped shadows, but I hadn't destroyed the force that had created their prison. And now, instead of one ancient entity collecting shadows in the depths of the forest, there were thousands of liberated shadow beings scattered throughout the mountains, each one learning to exist independently of the light that had once defined them. As I stood on the cabin's porch, watching my new neighbors settle into their freedom, I realized that my real nightmare was just beginning. Story 2. The first time I saw them perform, my hand was still bleeding from the rusty nail that had torn through my palm while removing the rotted floorboards. The metallic taste of fear filled my mouth as I watched translucent figures glide across the stage I had just finished clearing, their movements fluid and purposeful, enacting a scene I couldn't yet understand but somehow knew would haunt me forever. The Orpheum Theater had been abandoned for 37 years when I received the contract. The city council had finally decided to restore the crumbling monument to its former glory, and my reputation for breathing life back into forgotten buildings had earned me the job. What they hadn't mentioned in the briefing was the way shadows seemed to move independently of any light source, or how the air itself felt thick with decades of accumulated whispers. I should have recognized the warning signs from day one. The previous contractor had walked off the job after only 2 weeks, citing creative differences with the project manager. When I pressed for details, the manager had simply mentioned something about the man becoming increasingly agitated about noises from the stage area. I dismissed it as typical renovation stress. Old buildings always settled and creaked in unsettling ways. My first week passed without incident. I focused on the lobby and entrance areas, stripping away layers of peeling paint and replacing warped wooden panels. The work was methodical, satisfying in the way that only restoration could be. Each section I completed revealed another piece of the theater's original grandeur: ornate moldings, hand-carved details, intricate tile work that had been hidden beneath decades of neglect. It was when I finished the main lobby that I first felt the sensation of being watched. The hairs on my neck stood rigid as I packed up my tools that Friday evening. The silence seemed too complete, too deliberate. Every scrape of my toolbox against the floor echoed through the empty space with unnatural clarity. My breathing became shallow, quick puffs of air that seemed to disappear into the vast darkness beyond my work lights. I convinced myself it was nothing more than the natural unease that came with working alone in such a massive, empty space. Old theaters were notorious for their acoustic properties, every sound magnified, every echo distorted. The rational part of my mind cataloged these explanations while my hands trembled slightly as I locked up for the weekend. Monday brought the first performance. I had spent the morning working on the main auditorium, carefully removing water-damaged sections of the ornate ceiling. The stage itself remained shrouded in darkness, my work lights focused on the immediate repair area. Around noon, as I climbed down from the scaffolding to grab lunch, movement caught my peripheral vision. 3 figures stood center stage, their forms shimmering like heat mirages. My heart hammered against my ribs as I tried to focus on them directly, but they seemed to exist in that space between seeing and not seeing. A woman in an elaborate Victorian gown gestured dramatically toward the balcony, while 2 men in formal dress flanked her. Their mouths moved with obvious dialogue, but no sound reached my ears. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes with paint-stained fingers. When I looked again, the stage was empty. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stood frozen in the aisle, every muscle tense with the primitive instinct to flee. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool temperature of the unheated building. That afternoon I found myself working with obsessive focus, as if keeping busy could somehow dispel what I had witnessed. But concentration proved impossible. Every peripheral shadow became a potential figure, every creak of settling wood a footstep on the stage. My hands shook so badly that I had to stop using power tools, afraid I would injure myself. The performances began appearing with increasing frequency as I completed each section of the restoration. After finishing the orchestra pit, I witnessed a solo pianist, his translucent fingers dancing across keys that produced no sound. The balcony renovation was followed by an entire phantom audience, their silent applause rippling through the empty seats like wind through wheat. Each appearance lasted exactly 17 minutes. I began timing them obsessively, my watch becoming an anchor to reality as the supernatural performances played out before me. During those 17 minutes, my body betrayed me completely. Cold sweats, racing pulse, the sensation that my skin was crawling with invisible insects. My mouth went dry as desert sand, and I found myself holding my breath until my lungs burned. The breakthrough came when I recognized the first scene. The Victorian woman and her 2 companions were enacting the exact sequence of events that had led to my hiring for this project. The woman represented the city council member who had contacted me, her gestures matching perfectly the enthusiastic sales pitch I had received about the theater's potential. The 2 men were the previous contractors who had abandoned the job, their transparent forms showing them walking away in defeat and frustration. This revelation should have been relief, an explanation for the impossible visions I had been experiencing. Instead, it filled me with a dread so profound that I vomited behind the stage, my body rejecting this new understanding of what I was witnessing. These weren't random ghostly performances. They were prophecies, glimpses into events that had already occurred or were yet to come. The realization made me obsessive about watching each new performance, desperate to decode their meanings. The solo pianist predicted the discovery of original sheet music hidden in the theater's walls, music I found exactly where the phantom's gestures had indicated, 3 days after the vision. The applauding audience foretold the arrival of the city's Historical Preservation Committee, who appeared unannounced to inspect my progress exactly 17 days later. My sleep became fragmented, broken by dreams of translucent actors performing scenes I couldn't yet understand. I would wake with my sheets soaked in sweat, my heart racing from visions of performances yet to come. During the day, I found myself analyzing every gesture, every movement, trying to decode the temporal puzzles being presented to me. The performances grew more complex as I neared completion of the main restoration. Entire storylines played out across multiple appearances, characters reappearing in different configurations to show interconnected events. My notebook filled with sketches and desperate attempts to map the prophetic timeline I was witnessing. It was the penultimate performance that changed everything. As I finished restoring the stage itself, the final major component of the project, the entire theater filled with phantom performers. Every seat held a translucent audience member, the stage bloomed with dozens of actors, and even the aisles hosted spectral ushers and vendors. But this time, they all turned to look directly at me. The sensation of being the focus of hundreds of non-existent eyes was overwhelming. My knees buckled, and I grabbed the nearest seat back to keep from collapsing. The blood rushed from my face so quickly that black spots danced in my vision. Every phantom in the theater stared with expressions of desperate urgency, their silent mouths moving in obvious attempts to communicate something crucial. Then I understood. This wasn't just a performance about future events. It was a performance about the theater itself, about what would happen when the restoration was complete and the first real audience returned. But the urgency in their expressions suggested something terrible about that future opening night. The final revelation came during the last performance, after I had completed every repair, every restoration, every careful detail that would return the Orpheum to its former glory. I stood in the completed lobby, admiring my work, when the entire theater filled with light and sound for the first time. This performance wasn't silent. The Phantom Orchestra played with full volume. The actors delivered their lines with projection that filled every corner of the space, and the audience responded with thunderous applause. But what they were performing was the story of a restoration contractor who, upon completing his work, discovered that he could never leave. I watched myself on stage, my own translucent form moving through the motions of packing up tools, walking toward the exit, reaching for the door handle, and then beginning the process again. An endless loop of attempted departure, trapped forever in the theater I had restored. My real hands began to shake as I reached for the actual exit door. The handle turned, but the door wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, threw my shoulder against it, kicked at the hinges. Nothing. The door that had opened and closed normally for months now remained sealed, as if it had never been designed to open at all. Behind me, the Phantom performance continued, showing my endless loop of attempted escape, while the ghostly audience applauded my eternal contribution to their otherworldly theater company. The other translucent figures I'd been watching, they weren't just random spirits. They were previous contractors, previous workers, previous visitors who had become permanent cast members in the Orpheum's supernatural repertoire. The theater hadn't been abandoned for 37 years. It had been collecting. Now I understand why the performances always lasted exactly 17 minutes. That's how long it takes for the initial shock of realization to fade into acceptance. How long before the fight drains out of someone trapped in this place? How long before they begin to fade into translucency themselves? I can feel it beginning already. The way my reflection in the lobby mirrors seems less solid than before. My footsteps echo differently, as if I'm becoming lighter, less present in the physical world. Soon I'll be performing alongside the others, enacting scenes for the next contractor who will inevitably be hired to restore the theater that never truly needs restoration. The city council will express concern about my disappearance, just as they had about the others. They'll hire a new contractor with an excellent reputation for restoration work. The cycle will continue, the theater's cast growing larger with each iteration. And I'll be here, watching from the stage, my translucent form trying desperately to warn the next victim through silent performances they won't understand until it's too late. We all will be a growing company of phantom actors in a theater that feeds on the very people who try to bring it back to life. The Orpheum Theater is now perfectly restored, exactly as it was meant to be. The only thing left is the opening night that will never come, because the real performance never stops. We are the show, and the show must go on. Story 3. Time has a way of betraying you when you least expect it. I learned this truth the hard way, through sleepless nights and a growing certainty that something ancient and malevolent had found its way into my home, wrapped in the innocent disguise of brass gears and Roman numerals. The flea market sprawled across the abandoned parking lot like a plague of forgotten memories. Vendors hunched over tables laden with the detritus of other people's lives, chipped teacups, moth-eaten clothing, and electronics that had died decades before smartphones were even conceived. The October air carried the scent of rust and regret, and I should have recognized it as a warning. I wasn't looking for anything in particular that Saturday morning. My apartment felt too empty, too quiet since Sarah had moved out 3 months earlier, taking with her not just her belongings but the ambient noise of shared existence. The silence had become a living thing, pressing against my eardrums until I could hear my own pulse thundering in the void. That's when I saw it. The clock sat incongruously among a collection of plastic jewelry and water-damaged paperbacks. It was an antique mantel clock, its brass case tarnished to a deep green patina that spoke of decades, perhaps centuries, of neglect. The face was ivory-colored porcelain, cracked in a spiderweb pattern that somehow enhanced, rather than diminished its elegance. Roman numerals marked the hours, and the hands were frozen at 3:33. The vendor was a woman in her 70s, her fingers gnarled with arthritis as she wrapped my purchase in yellowed newspaper. She mentioned something about the clock coming from an estate sale, the previous owner having no family to claim it. I paid the $20 without haggling, driven by an impulse I couldn't name. Back in my apartment, I placed the clock on the mantelpiece above my unused fireplace. It fit perfectly, as if the space had been waiting for it. I wound the mechanism with the small brass key that had been tied to its base with a frayed piece of twine. The clock began ticking immediately, a steady rhythm that filled the silence I'd grown to hate. For 3 days, it kept perfect time. On the 4th night, I woke to absolute silence. My bedside digital clock read 3:34 a.m., but the antique clock in the living room had stopped. When I stumbled out to investigate, heart hammering against my ribs, I found the hands frozen once again at 3:33. The pendulum hung motionless, though I was certain I'd wound it just that morning. I reset the time and wound the spring again, my fingers trembling slightly as I manipulated the delicate hands. The ticking resumed, but something felt different. The rhythm seemed heavier now, more deliberate, as if each tick was counting down to something I couldn't comprehend. The next night, the same thing happened, and the night after that. By the end of the first week, I developed a ritual. Every morning, I would wind the clock and set it to the correct time. Every night, I would wake at 3:34 to find it stopped at 3:33. My sleep became fragmented, my days punctuated by an anticipation that tasted like copper in my mouth. It was during the second week that I first noticed the sounds. I'd grown accustomed to waking at 3:34, so when the clock's silence roused me again, I wasn't surprised. What sent ice water through my veins was the sound that accompanied the stillness, a soft scratching coming from inside the walls. It started faint, like mice in the insulation, but grew louder and more purposeful. The scratching moved in patterns, tracing geometric shapes I could almost visualize but never quite understand. I pressed my ear to the drywall, my breathing shallow and rapid. The scratching stopped immediately, as if whatever was making the sound had suddenly become aware of my attention. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat so clearly it seemed to echo through the apartment. The scratching resumed the moment I pulled away from the wall. I spent the rest of that night sitting in my kitchen, every light in the apartment blazing, drinking coffee with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. When dawn finally crept through my windows, the scratching had long since stopped, and the clock ticked merrily along as if nothing had happened. But something had changed in my apartment. The shadows seemed deeper now, lingering in corners where the overhead lights should have banished them completely. The air felt thicker, pregnant with an anticipation that made my skin crawl. Even during the day, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, certain that something was watching me from just outside my peripheral vision. The third week brought new horrors. Now, when the clock stopped at 3:33, the temperature in my apartment would plummet. My breath would mist in the sudden cold, and frost would form on the windows despite the October warmth outside. The cold seemed to emanate from the clock itself, radiating outward in waves that penetrated my pajamas and settled deep in my bones. But it was the whispers that finally broke my resolve to rationalize what was happening. They started so softly I thought they might be the wind, or the building settling, or my imagination finally succumbing to the stress of broken sleep and mounting paranoia. But gradually, they became more distinct. I couldn't make out words, but the cadence was unmistakably human. Multiple voices speaking in urgent, overlapping tones that seemed to come from every direction at once. I began taking notes, documenting each incident with the desperate precision of a man trying to prove his own sanity. The scratching followed specific patterns, The whispers always came from the direction of the clock. The temperature drop was exactly 17 degrees each time, as measured by a thermometer I'd placed on the mantel. The voices were trying to tell me something. I was certain of it now. On the 20th night, I decided to stay awake and observe. I positioned myself in the living room with a clear view of the clock, armed with a flashlight, notebook, and thermos of coffee. My pulse thundered in my ears as I watched the hands approach the fateful time. At exactly 3:33, the clock's ticking stopped with a sound like a bone snapping. The temperature plummeted instantly, and my breath came out in sharp puffs of vapor. The whispers began, but this time they were different, clearer, more urgent. And for the first time, I could make out fragments of words. Turn. Back. Before too late. My hands trembled as I scribbled the words in my notebook, the pen nearly slipping from my numb fingers. The scratching in the walls had resumed, but now I could hear it wasn't random. It was tracing letters, spelling out words I couldn't quite decipher through the drywall. Then I heard footsteps. They came from directly above me, in the apartment upstairs that had been vacant for months. Slow, deliberate steps crossing from one end of the room to the other, then back again. The sound was muffled but unmistakable. Someone was pacing in the empty apartment above. My mouth went dry as sand. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee the building and never return. But something deeper, more primal, kept me rooted to the spot. I needed to understand. I needed to know what the clock was trying to show me. The footsteps stopped directly above the clock. Then I heard it, a sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was the screech of metal on metal, followed by a crash that shook the entire building. The sound repeated 3 times, each crash more violent than the last. And then silence. The whispers resumed, more frantic now, overlapping and echoing until they filled my head like static. The words became clearer, more urgent. Stop the clock. Break the cycle before it takes you too. My vision blurred with tears I didn't remember shedding. The cold had penetrated so deep that my joints ached with it. But I forced myself to stand, to walk to the mantel where the clock sat like a malevolent shrine. The hands hadn't moved from 3:33, but as I watched, they began to turn backward. Slowly at first, then faster, spinning counterclockwise with increasing speed. The whispers rose to a crescendo, and I could finally understand them completely. They were warnings. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all trying to warn me about the clock. They spoke of others who had owned it, who had fallen victim to its influence. The scratching in the walls wasn't random. It was the desperate attempts of previous owners to leave messages, to warn whoever came next. I understood now why the apartment upstairs had been vacant. I understood the crashes, the footsteps, the growing sense of dread that had been building since I'd brought the clock home. The previous tenant had owned it before me. The crashes were the sound of his final, desperate attempt to destroy it before it could claim him completely. But he had failed. And if I didn't act soon, I would join the chorus of voices trapped within its mechanisms. With a strength born of terror and desperation, I grabbed the clock from the mantel. It was burning cold against my palms, so frigid it felt like fire. The whispers became screams now, begging me to stop, to save myself, to break the cycle before it was too late. I raised the clock above my head and hurled it against the brick wall of the fireplace. The crash was deafening. Brass gears and springs scattered across the floor, and the porcelain face shattered into 1,000 pieces. But even as the physical clock lay destroyed at my feet, the ticking continued, not from the broken mechanism, but from inside my own head. The whispers were fading now, but their final message was clear. You waited too long. You're part of it now. 3:33 will always find you. That was 6 months ago. I moved out of the apartment the next day, leaving everything behind except the clothes on my back. I've changed addresses 4 times since then, but it doesn't matter. Every night at 3:33, no matter where I am, time stops for me. The temperature drops, the whispers return, and I can feel the weight of invisible eyes watching me from the shadows. I've tried to destroy every clock in my presence, but they keep appearing. On nightstands, kitchen counters, even painted on walls in places where no clock should exist. The brass hands always point to 3:33, and the ticking has become the soundtrack to my deteriorating sanity. The worst part isn't the supernatural manifestations or the growing certainty that I'm losing my mind. It's the knowledge that someday, someone else will find a broken clock at a flea market or estate sale. They'll take it home, wind it up, and think they've found a charming antique. And when they do, I'll become one of the voices trying desperately to warn them, trapped forever in the mechanism of time itself, counting down the seconds until 3:33 comes again. Story 4. The beam cut through the darkness like a scalpel through flesh, revealing what should have remained hidden beneath the black waters of Thornwick Lake. I'd come to this god-forsaken place seeking solitude, desperate to escape the suffocating weight of recent events that had turned my life upside down. The company layoffs, the divorce papers, the endless questions from concerned friends who couldn't understand why I'd simply stopped answering their calls. Thornwick Lake promised isolation, a place where the only sounds would be the gentle lapping of water against my rented boat and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. The locals in town had given me strange looks when I'd mentioned my destination. The elderly woman at the bait shop had hesitated before ringing up my purchase, her weathered fingers drumming against the counter as she studied my face with an intensity that made my skin crawl. She'd mentioned something about the lake being different at night, but I'd dismissed her words as small-town superstition designed to keep city folk away from their secret fishing spots. Now, 3 hours into my midnight excursion, I was beginning to understand what she meant. The first sign that something was wrong came when my flashlight beam swept across the water during a routine check of my lines. For just a moment, I thought I glimpsed something pale moving beneath the surface, a flash of translucent white that disappeared as soon as I tried to focus on it. My heart rate spiked, sending a cold rush of adrenaline through my veins. I told myself it was just a large fish, maybe a pike or muskie disturbed by the artificial light. But fish don't have faces. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my palm already slick with sweat despite the cool September air. The beam trembled as I directed it back toward the same spot, scanning the dark water with growing unease. Nothing. Just the endless black mirror reflecting my light back at me, broken only by the gentle ripples created by a breeze that seemed to whisper secrets I couldn't quite make out. My breathing had become shallow, each exhale visible in small puffs of vapor that dissipated quickly in the night air. The silence around me felt oppressive, as if the entire lake was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Even the usual sounds of night wildlife, the distant call of owls, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, seemed muted and far away. I forced myself to focus on the task at hand, checking my lines and adjusting my position in the small aluminum boat. The gentle rocking motion that had initially been soothing now felt unsettling, as if something large was moving beneath me, causing the subtle shifts in the water's surface. My mouth had gone dry, and I reached for the thermos of coffee I'd brought, grateful for the familiar ritual of unscrewing the cap and taking a sip of the still warm liquid. That's when I saw them. The flashlight beam had been pointing downward as I'd reached for the thermos, and in that brief moment of illumination, I saw not one but several translucent forms moving through the water below my boat. They were humanoid in shape, but wrong in every other conceivable way. Elongated limbs that moved with an unsettling fluidity, faces that seemed to shift and change even as I watched, and most disturbing of all, eyes that appeared to be looking directly at me. The coffee cup slipped from my numb fingers, clattering against the bottom of the boat and sending the hot liquid splashing across my boots. My hands were shaking so violently now that the flashlight beam danced erratically across the water's surface, creating a strobe effect that made the creatures appear to be moving in stuttering, mechanical jerks. But they weren't trying to hide from the light. They were drawn to it. As I watched in growing horror, more of the translucent beings began to appear, rising from the depths like pale ghosts emerging from some underwater cemetery. They moved with purpose, their elongated forms gliding through the water with an otherworldly grace that defied everything I understood about physics and biology. Some appeared almost human, while others were grotesquely distorted, as if they were incomplete copies of people I might have once known. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Hallucinations brought on by stress and lack of sleep. Some kind of bioluminescent phenomenon I'd never heard of. Massive jellyfish or other translucent marine life that had somehow made their way into a freshwater lake. But even as I grasped for these logical anchors, a deeper part of my consciousness was recoiling in primal terror, recognizing something fundamentally alien about what I was witnessing. The beings seemed to be trying to communicate, their movements becoming more deliberate and coordinated. They would rise to just beneath the surface, their pale forms clearly visible in my flashlight beam, and then begin what could only be described as gestures. One creature, and calling it a creature felt wrong, as if I was diminishing something far more significant, raised what appeared to be an arm and pointed directly at me. Not at the boat, not at the general area where I sat, but specifically at me, as if it knew exactly who I was. Cold sweat was now running down my back, soaking through my jacket and creating an uncomfortable dampness that made me shiver uncontrollably. My breathing had become rapid and shallow, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my temples. The urge to start the motor and race back to shore was overwhelming, but something kept me frozen in place. A morbid fascination that overrode my survival instincts. More beings continued to emerge from the depths, and as they did, I began to notice details that made my stomach churn with recognition. One had a face that reminded me of my father, though distorted and stretched in ways that made it barely recognizable. Another seemed to bear a resemblance to my college roommate Marcus, who had died in a car accident 5 years ago. But these weren't just random similarities. There was something deliberate about these forms, as if they were specifically chosen to trigger memories I'd tried to bury. The pointed gestures became more insistent, and I realized they weren't just trying to get my attention. They were trying to show me something. Following the direction of their elongated appendages, I turned the flashlight beam toward the shore, scanning the tree line until the light fell upon something that made my blood turn to ice. There, among the dense pine trees, stood a small cabin I was certain hadn't been there when I'd launched my boat hours earlier. The structure looked old and weathered, as if it had been abandoned for decades, but there was a warm, yellow glow emanating from its windows that suggested recent habitation. What disturbed me most was how familiar it looked, like a cabin my family had rented during summer vacations when I was young, though those trips had taken place hundreds of miles from here. When I turned back to the water, the translucent beings had arranged themselves in a rough circle around my boat. Their faces, for they did have faces, though they shifted and changed like reflections in disturbed water, were turned upward toward me with an expectant expression that chilled me to the bone. They weren't threatening, exactly, but there was an urgency to their movements that suggested time was running out for something important. One of the creatures began to rise higher in the water, its form becoming more solid and defined as it approached the surface. Features I hadn't been able to make out clearly before came into sharp focus, and I let out a strangled gasp as I recognized the face staring back at me. It was my own face, but younger, the face I'd worn as a teenager before life had worn me down with its endless disappointments and betrayals. The younger version of myself opened its mouth, and though no sound emerged that I could hear, I somehow understood what it was trying to tell me. Memories that I'd suppressed for decades began flooding back with crystalline clarity. Memories of this lake, of that cabin, of events that had happened here when I was 16 years old, during what I'd always believed was a family camping trip to a completely different location. My hands were shaking so violently now that I could barely hold the flashlight steady. Sweat was pouring off me despite the cool night air, and my breathing had become so rapid that I was beginning to feel lightheaded. The boat rocked more violently as more creatures gathered around it, their pale forms creating an otherworldly constellation beneath the black water. The memories kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last. I remembered being here with my family, but not for a vacation. We'd come here for a reason that had something to do with my father's work that I'd never fully understood, but which had required long absences and secretive phone calls that stopped abruptly whenever I entered the room. I remembered my mother's nervous energy during that trip. the way she'd watched me constantly as if afraid I might disappear at any moment. And I remembered the night when everything had changed. The translucent beings below me began to move in unison, their forms swirling around my boat in a pattern that seemed almost ritualistic. The water itself began to glow with a faint phosphorescence that had nothing to do with any natural phenomenon I'd ever witnessed. The glow intensified as more memories surfaced. Memories of being brought to this very spot in the middle of the night, of watching as my father and several other men performed some kind of ceremony that had ended with my being submerged in these very waters. I remembered the feeling of drowning, of the lake water filling my lungs as consciousness slipped away. But I also remembered waking up the next morning in the cabin, my parents acting as if nothing had happened, my father explaining away my fragmented memories as a nightmare brought on by too much campfire storytelling. But it hadn't been a nightmare. The being with my younger face rose even closer to the surface, and this time when its mouth moved, I could hear the words as clearly as if they were being spoken directly into my mind. It told me about the others who had been brought here over the years, about the experiments conducted beneath the lake's surface, about the price paid for knowledge that mankind wasn't meant to possess. It explained how part of me had been left behind in these waters, while something else had been sent back to live my life. The flashlight slipped from my numb fingers, clattering into the bottom of the boat and casting wild shadows as it rolled back and forth. In the intermittent illumination, I could see that the creatures had multiplied exponentially. Dozens of translucent forms now surrounded my boat, all of them bearing faces I recognized from my past. Friends, family members, even strangers I'd glimpsed briefly throughout my life. They were all there, preserved in this underwater museum of stolen moments and borrowed identities. My breathing was coming in short, panicked gasps now, and my vision was beginning to tunnel as the full implications of what I was learning crashed over me like a tsunami of impossible truth. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my identity, even my own memories, was a carefully constructed lie designed to hide the fact that the real me had never left this lake. The being with my face reached the surface and extended one translucent hand toward me. As our fingers touched, the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place with devastating clarity. I understood now why my life had always felt like I was playing a role rather than living authentically. I understood why I'd never felt truly connected to the people around me, why relationships always felt hollow and meaningless, why success and failure affected me with equal indifference. Because I wasn't really living. I was just a copy, a placeholder sent to fulfill the life of someone who had died in these waters decades ago. The phosphorescent glow beneath the water intensified, and I felt an overwhelming urge to join my true self in the depths below. The copy that had been living my life for all these years suddenly felt like an ill-fitting costume that I was desperate to remove. The translucent beings watched with patient eyes as I stood up in the rocking boat, my legs unsteady beneath me. But then I heard it, the distant sound of a car engine starting somewhere near the shore. The sound snapped me back to the present moment, reminding me that regardless of what I'd learned about my origins, there was still a life above the surface that needed to be lived. The beings below seemed to sense my hesitation, and their expressions shifted to something that might have been disappointment, or perhaps understanding. The one with my face spoke again, but this time the words carried a different message. It told me that now that I knew the truth, I could choose to reclaim my authentic existence, or continue living the borrowed life I'd been given. But it also warned me that knowledge of this magnitude came with a price. I would never again be able to look at my reflection without seeing the pale, translucent features of my true self staring back. As the engine sound grew louder, presumably from someone preparing for an early morning fishing expedition, the creatures began to sink back into the depths. The phosphorescent glow faded gradually until the water returned to its natural black state, leaving only my flashlight beam to illuminate the now empty surface. I sat back down in the boat with legs that felt like rubber, my entire body trembling from a combination of cold, fear, and the overwhelming weight of revelation. The rational part of my mind tried to reassert itself, suggesting that what I'd experienced was nothing more than an elaborate hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But deep down, I knew better. As dawn approached and I finally started the motor to head back to shore, I caught my reflection in the calm water one last time. For just a moment, in the pre-dawn light, my face appeared translucent and ethereal, exactly like the beings I'd encountered beneath the surface. I never returned to Thornwick Lake, but the truth I'd learned there followed me back to my ordinary life like a shadow that couldn't be shaken. Every time I looked in a mirror, every time I tried to form a genuine connection with another person, every time I attempted to feel real emotion about the events of my daily existence, I was reminded that I was living a borrowed life, with borrowed feelings in a borrowed body. The worst part wasn't the knowledge itself. It was the choice I'd been given, and the uncertainty about whether I'd made the right decision. Sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep, I wondered if the translucent beings were still down there, waiting patiently for me to return and reclaim the authentic existence I'd left behind in those dark waters. And sometimes, I wondered if next time, I'd have the courage to join them. Story 5. The static always starts the same way. A low, electric whisper that crawls under my skin, like insects seeking warmth. Then come the voices, bleeding through decades of silence, carrying secrets that were never meant to resurface. I should have thrown the damn radio away the moment I received it, but curiosity has always been my weakness. Now, 3 weeks later, I'm questioning whether the voices belong to the dead, or if I'm simply losing my mind. Uncle Theodore had been dead for 6 months before the lawyer contacted me. I barely remembered the man, a shadowy figure from childhood family gatherings who smelled of pipe tobacco and spoke in whispers. The inheritance surprised everyone, especially since we'd spoken maybe twice in my adult life. Among his possessions was an antique Philco radio from the 1940s, its mahogany cabinet scarred and its chrome dials tarnished green. The lawyer mentioned that Theodore had been obsessed with the device, spending his final years hunched over it in his study, claiming he could hear things others couldn't. I should have recognized the warning. The radio sat in my apartment for 2 weeks before I plugged it in. My job at the insurance company had been particularly draining, and I'd developed a habit of coming home to an increasingly empty space that echoed with the loneliness of a man approaching 40 with nothing to show for it, except a mortgage and a growing collection of regrets. The radio seemed like it might provide some comfort, perhaps some classical music to fill the void. The first time I turned it on, nothing happened. The tubes glowed amber, warming slowly, but no sound emerged from the fabric speaker. I twisted the dial through various frequencies, hearing only the standard buzz of electrical interference. Disappointed, I switched it off and forgot about it for another few days. The second attempt yielded different results. I was adjusting the antenna when the static suddenly cleared, revealing a conversation in progress. 2 men were discussing business matters, their voices distant but clear, speaking about stock prices and market predictions. What struck me as odd was their discussion of companies I'd never heard of, using terminology that seemed outdated. The conversation lasted perhaps 10 minutes before dissolving back into static. Initially, I assumed I'd stumbled across some obscure talk radio station. Ham radio operators often used unusual frequencies, and vintage equipment sometimes picked up signals differently than modern devices. I made note of the frequency and tried to find it again the following evening. This time, the voices belonged to a woman and an older man engaged in what sounded like a therapy session. The woman was describing recurring nightmares about drowning, her voice trembling with an emotion so raw it made my chest tighten. The therapist responded with techniques I recognized from psychology courses I'd taken in college, but his approach seemed outdated, almost archaic. When the woman mentioned the year, 1967, my blood went cold. I sat frozen in my leather chair, the room suddenly feeling colder despite the heating running at full capacity. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be an explanation. Perhaps this was some kind of historical radio drama or documentary featuring recordings from the past, but the conversation felt too intimate, too real, carrying the weight of genuine human suffering. Over the following nights, I became obsessed with the radio. Each evening, I would carefully tune to different frequencies, discovering more conversations spanning decades. A couple arguing about financial troubles in 1952, a group of friends planning a camping trip in 1973, a woman confessing an affair to her priest in 1981. The voices were always clear, always intimate, always accompanied by specific dates and details that, when I researched them online, proved historically accurate. My sleep began to suffer. I would lie awake thinking about the voices, their words echoing in my head long after I'd turned off the radio. The woman from 1967 particularly haunted me. Her descriptions of drowning dreams so vivid I began having similar nightmares myself. I would wake gasping, feeling phantom water filling my lungs, my sheets soaked with sweat that smelled faintly of lake water. The physical toll became noticeable within a week. My hands developed a tremor that made it difficult to type at work. My heart would race without warning, pounding so hard against my ribs that I feared my colleagues could hear it. I lost weight as my appetite disappeared, replaced by a constant knot of anxiety in my stomach that made eating feel impossible. But I couldn't stop listening. The breakthrough came on a Thursday night when I discovered I could influence which conversations I heard. By concentrating on specific time periods while adjusting the dial, I could navigate through decades of recorded human experience. The realization terrified me more than anything else. This wasn't random radio reception. Something was responding to my intentions, feeding me exactly what I focused on. That night I heard my own voice. The conversation was from 3 months ago, a phone call I'd made to my ex-wife during one of my lowest moments. I listened to myself begging her to reconsider our divorce, my voice slurred with alcohol and desperation. The shame burned through me like acid as I heard her gentle but firm rejection, her explanation that I'd become someone she no longer recognized. The radio had somehow captured and stored that private moment, along with thousands of others. I began researching the radio's history, diving into Uncle Theodore's background with growing urgency. What I discovered made my hands shake as I typed search queries into my laptop. Theodore hadn't been the radio's first owner. The device had belonged to a series of people over the decades, each of whom had died under mysterious circumstances, not violent deaths, but unexplained ones. Heart attacks in healthy individuals, sudden strokes in people with no medical history suggesting such risks. The pattern was clear once I knew where to look. Each owner had become obsessed with the radio before their death, spending increasing amounts of time listening to voices from the past. Neighbors described erratic behavior, social withdrawal, and complaints about being watched or followed. Several had been found dead in their homes, the radio still playing static in rooms that shouldn't have had power. My own behavior was following the same trajectory. I'd called in sick to work 3 times in the past week, unable to tear myself away from the radio. My apartment had become a disaster zone of takeout containers and unwashed clothes. I'd stopped answering my phone, afraid that somehow the radio would capture those conversations too. The voices were becoming more recent, more familiar. I heard my neighbors arguing through thin walls, conversations I'd overheard months ago now playing back with crystal clarity. I heard my own voice during job interviews, during conversations with friends, during moments I thought were private. The radio was somehow connected to every significant moment of human interaction, storing them like a vast library of secrets. The paranoia set in gradually, then all at once. I began to suspect that the radio wasn't just receiving these conversations. It was broadcasting them too. Every time I spoke in my apartment, I imagined someone else hearing my words through their own vintage receiver. The idea that my private thoughts and conversations might be stored and replayed for future listeners made my skin crawl with invisible insects. I started speaking in whispers, then stopped speaking aloud altogether when I was home. But the radio seemed to respond to my thoughts as well, tuning itself to conversations that reflected my mental state. When I thought about my failed marriage, it would play arguments between couples. When I worried about my job, it broadcast discussions about career failures and financial ruin. The device was reading my mind. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the static from the other room, calling to me like a siren song. I would resist for hours, but eventually, I always found myself padding barefoot across the cold hardwood floor, switching on the radio in the darkness of my living room. The conversations were becoming more disturbing. I heard confessions of crimes, descriptions of violence, admissions of terrible secrets that people had carried to their graves. The radio seemed to be drawing me deeper into humanity's darkest corners, showing me the hidden rot beneath the surface of ordinary lives. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a stranger, hollow-eyed, gaunt, with skin the color of old paper. My hands shook constantly now, and I'd developed a twitch in my left eye that made it appear I was constantly winking at invisible conspirators. My heart maintained a rapid, irregular rhythm that felt like a caged bird trying to escape my chest. The decisive moment came on a Sunday morning when I heard my mother's voice coming through the speaker. She was talking to my father about their concerns for my mental health, a conversation they'd had 6 months ago after my divorce was finalized. Hearing their worry and love filtered through the radio's static made something snap inside me. I realized the radio wasn't just collecting conversations, it was feeding on them. Every moment of human connection, every secret shared, every emotion expressed became fuel for whatever dark entity lived within its mahogany cabinet. It was growing stronger while its listeners grew weaker, drawing life force from the very act of listening to stolen intimacies. Uncle Theodore hadn't died of natural causes. He'd been drained, literally consumed by his obsession with the device. The radio had fed on him until there was nothing left but an empty shell, then moved on to its next victim. Me. Understanding the trap didn't make escaping it any easier. The radio had become an addiction more powerful than any drug. Even knowing it was killing me, I felt compelled to return to it each night, drawn by the promise of hearing one more secret, learning one more hidden truth about the people around me. But knowledge has its own power, and I began to fight back. I researched techniques for breaking obsessive behaviors, for resisting compulsions that felt beyond my control. I removed the radio from my living room, storing it in a closet and covering it with heavy blankets. When that wasn't enough to muffle its call, I moved it to the basement storage unit of my apartment building. The withdrawal was brutal. My entire body ached as if I were fighting off a severe illness. I experienced hallucinations, phantom voices drifting through my apartment, the sound of static emanating from electronic devices that weren't even turned on. My hands shook so violently I couldn't hold a coffee cup without spilling. But slowly, incrementally, I began to reclaim pieces of myself. I forced myself to return to work, to engage in normal human interactions that didn't involve stolen conversations from the past. I started exercising again, trying to rebuild the physical strength the radio had leached from my body. Most importantly, I began talking to people again, real people, in real time, having genuine conversations that belong to the present moment. The radio remains in storage, waiting. I can feel its presence like a cold spot in the building's foundation, a pocket of hungry darkness that occasionally sends tendrils of temptation up through the floors. Sometimes late at night, I imagine I can hear it calling to me through dozens of layers of concrete and steel. I've written letters to warn potential future inheritors, though I doubt anyone would believe such an outlandish story. The radio will find its way to someone else eventually. Devices like that always do. They have a hunger that can only be satisfied by human connection, by the intimate moments that make us who we are. But I've learned something important about the nature of secrets and the price of forbidden knowledge. Some things are meant to remain in the past, buried with the people who lived them. The radio offers the illusion of connection while actually destroying it, replacing genuine human interaction with the voyeuristic consumption of stolen intimacies. I still wake up sometimes with the phantom sound of static in my ears, still feel the urge to return to that basement storage unit and resurrect the voices of the dead. But I resist, focusing instead on the voices of the living, on conversations that exist in the present moment and belong to me. The static may always be there, waiting just beneath the surface of my consciousness. But I've learned to tune it out, to choose the living world over the seductive whispers of the past. Some frequencies are too dangerous to explore, some voices too costly to hear. The radio taught me that the most terrifying truths aren't always supernatural. Sometimes they're simply human. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is choose not to listen. Story 6. The silence in the Grandview Hotel wasn't really silence at all. It was the kind of quiet that pressed against your eardrums, thick with the weight of abandoned dreams and forgotten conversations. As I stood in the lobby, my camera hanging heavy around my neck, I could feel something watching me from the shadows that pooled in every corner, something that had been waiting in this place far longer than any guest should. I'd driven 3 hours through winding mountain roads to reach this place, commissioned by a historical preservation society to document the hotel's current state before they decided whether to demolish or restore it. The Grandview had been shuttered for 15 years, ever since a series of unfortunate incidents had driven away the last of its clientele. Nothing deadly, they'd assured me. Just a string of complaints about strange noises, doors that wouldn't stay closed, and guests who checked out in the middle of the night, wild-eyed and babbling about things that couldn't possibly be real. The afternoon sun slanted through grimy windows, casting long rectangular patches of dusty light across the faded carpet. My footsteps echoed in the vast space as I moved toward the reception desk, its marble surface now dulled with years of neglect. The brass fittings had tarnished to a sickly green, and the guest registry lay open to a page dated March 15, 2009, the hotel's final day of operation. I clicked my first photograph, the camera's flash illuminating the space in harsh white light for a split second. In that brief moment, I could have sworn I saw movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned, there was nothing but empty doorways and the gentle sway of a cobweb caught in some unfelt breeze. My throat felt dry as I swallowed, tasting dust and something else, something metallic and stale. The air seemed thick, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years, yet I could feel it moving around me in subtle currents that raised the hair on my arms. The elevator banks stood before me like gaping wounds, their brass doors frozen half open, revealing the dark throat of the shaft beyond. I'd already decided to take the stairs. The power had been cut years ago, and even if it hadn't been, I wouldn't have trusted the ancient cables to hold my weight. The stairwell beckoned from beside the elevators, its entrance marked by a small brass placard that read, "Guest Floors 2-8." As I climbed, my hand trailing along the banister, I noticed how my fingers came away coated with a fine layer of dust that seemed to shimmer in the dim light filtering down from above. The carpet on the stairs was worn thin in the center, showing the ghost patterns of thousands of footsteps, all the people who had once climbed these same steps with their luggage, and their secrets and their hopes for whatever awaited them in their rooms. The second-floor hallway stretched before me like a tunnel, doors lining both sides in perfect symmetry. Room numbers glinted dully on tarnished brass plates. 201, 203, 205 on the left, 202, 204, 206 on the right. I raised my camera and began documenting the decay, the peeling wallpaper with its pattern of faded roses, the water stains that bloomed across the ceiling like brown flowers, the way the carpet had begun to curl at the edges where it met the walls. That's when I heard it. A soft click, like a door latch engaging. I stopped walking, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. The sound had come from somewhere ahead of me, though I couldn't pinpoint which room. I stood perfectly still, listening to the blood rushing in my ears, waiting for the sound to repeat. Instead, I heard something else, the slow, deliberate creak of a door opening. My mouth went dry as I watched room 207 swing open, revealing the darkness beyond. The movement was smooth, controlled, as if guided by an invisible hand. I found myself walking toward it, my feet carrying me forward, even as every rational part of my mind screamed at me to turn around and leave this place. The room beyond the doorway wasn't empty. A woman in a blue dress stood with her back to me, brushing her hair in front of a vanity mirror. The mirror reflected not her face, but the room as it must have been decades ago. Wallpaper bright and new, furniture polished to a high shine, late afternoon sunlight streaming through clean windows. She moved with the slow, careful motions of someone preparing for an important evening, each stroke of the brush deliberate and practiced. I blinked hard, my pulse pounding in my temples, and when I opened my eyes, the room was empty again. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light that fell through the grimy window, and the vanity was nothing more than a water-stained shell, its mirror cracked and reflecting only fragments of my own pale face. The door swung shut with the same soft click I'd heard before. My hands shook as I raised the camera and took a picture of the closed door. Through the viewfinder, everything looked normal, just another door in an abandoned hallway. But I could still smell something in the air, a faint trace of perfume and something else, something warm and alive that had no business existing in this dead place. I moved to the next door, then the next, documenting each one methodically, trying to force my mind back into the familiar rhythm of work. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that eyes were tracking my movement from behind every door I passed. Room 213 opened as I approached it. This time, a man in a business suit sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. His shoulders shook with silent sobs, and on the nightstand beside him, I could see the scattered pages of what looked like legal documents. Divorce papers, my mind supplied, though I couldn't read the words from where I stood. The man looked up, and for a moment, our eyes met across the threshold of decades. His face was my father's face. The camera slipped from my numb fingers, saved only by the strap around my neck. My father had never stayed in this hotel. He'd never even been to this state. He'd died 2 years ago in a hospice bed 3,000 miles away, his hand in mine as the machines that had kept him breathing finally fell silent. Yet there he sat, younger than I'd ever known him, wearing the gray suit he'd been buried in, looking at me with eyes full of pain and recognition. "Dad?" The word escaped my lips before I could stop it. The door slammed shut so hard that the number placard rattled against the wood. I stood there trembling, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Sweat had broken out across my forehead despite the chill in the air. My hands felt clammy as I wiped them on my jeans, trying to process what I'd just seen. Grief hallucination, my rational mind offered. Stress and the suggestive atmosphere of this place combining to create false memories, false visions. But the smell lingered. My father's cologne, the same brand he'd worn every day for 30 years. I forced myself to continue down the hallway. Each door I passed seemed to pulse with potential energy, as if the rooms beyond were holding their breath, waiting for their moment to reveal themselves. My heart hammered against my ribs with each step, and I could taste copper in my mouth where I'd bitten my tongue. Room 219 showed me my first apartment, the one I'd shared with Sarah during our brief marriage. She stood in the kitchenette, her back rigid with anger, gesturing at something I couldn't see. I remembered this fight. It had been about money, about the fact that I'd spent our grocery budget on camera equipment. She'd left that night, taking only what she could carry, and I'd never seen her again. But I'd never brought her here. We'd never stayed in any hotel together, let alone this one. Room 225 revealed my childhood bedroom, complete with the superhero posters and the desk where I'd done my homework. I sat there now, perhaps 8 years old, crying over a failed math test. My mother appeared in the doorway, younger than I remembered her, concern etched across her features as she moved to comfort a child who couldn't possibly be there. The pattern continued as I climbed to the 3rd floor, then the 4th. Each room that opened showed me scenes from my life, moments both mundane and profound playing out in endless repetition. My high school graduation, my first day at my current job, the afternoon I'd bought my camera, the morning I'd realized my marriage was over, all of it trapped behind these doors, as if the hotel had somehow absorbed not just the memories of its former guests, but of everyone who would ever walk its halls. By the time I reached the 6th floor, my shirt was soaked with sweat and my legs felt weak beneath me. The logical part of my mind kept insisting that this was impossible, that I was experiencing some kind of breakdown triggered by the isolation and the oppressive atmosphere. But the evidence of my senses was overwhelming. I could smell the familiar scents of each scene. My mother's cooking, the musty smell of my old apartment, the antiseptic odor of the hospital where my father had died. Room 612 nearly broke me. It showed me standing in this very hallway just moments ago, watching myself discover room 207 for the first time. I was looking at myself, an infinite regression that made my vision blur and my stomach lurch. The me in the room raised his camera to take a picture, and I felt the weight of my own camera around my neck grow heavier. I stumbled backward from the door, my back hitting the opposite wall. The impact sent a spider web of cracks spreading across the dusty wallpaper. My breathing came in ragged gasps, and black spots danced at the edges of my vision. I was hyperventilating, my body's fight-or-flight response triggered by something my mind couldn't process. That's when I realized the truth that had been building in the back of my consciousness since I'd first entered this place. I wasn't documenting the hotel's current state for any historical society. I couldn't remember driving here, couldn't remember receiving any commission. My memories of the outside world felt thin and distant, like half-remembered dreams. The phone number I'd been given to call when the job was finished. I couldn't recall the digits. The contact name was a blur in my mind. The only clear memories I had were of this place, of walking these halls, of watching these doors open and close. How long had I been here? Days? Weeks? The natural light filtering through the windows never seemed to change, trapped in the same dusty, late-afternoon glow that had greeted me when I'd first entered the lobby. My reflection in the cracked mirror of room 618 showed me the truth. My clothes were clean, my hair neat, my skin unmarked by days of wandering through dust and decay. I looked exactly as I had when I'd first arrived, whenever that had been. Time wasn't moving normally in this place. It was pooled and stagnant, like water in a forgotten basement. I was one of them now, one of the eternal guests, trapped in an endless cycle of the same moments, the same discoveries, the same growing horror. The hotel fed on memory, on the moments that defined us, and it had found in me a particularly rich source of nourishment. But unlike the other guests, I was aware of the cycle. I could see the pattern, understand what was happening, and with that understanding came a terrible choice. I could accept it, let myself fade into the routine of endless repetition, become another scene playing out behind another door for some future visitor to discover. Or I could fight it, try to break free from the cycle that held this place together. The elevator shaft called to me from the end of the hall, its darkness promising either escape or oblivion. I walked toward it slowly, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Behind me, I could hear doors beginning to open, all the rooms I'd visited starting their performances again. The sound of my father weeping, my mother's gentle voice, Sarah's angry words, all of it bleeding together into a chorus of memory made manifest. At the threshold of the elevator shaft, I turned back to look at the hallway one last time. Every door stood open now, golden light spilling from each room, illuminating the corridor like candles in a church. The scenes played out simultaneously, past and present and future all existing in the same moment, all the moments that had ever mattered reduced to an eternal now. I stepped into the darkness of the shaft, feeling the floor give way beneath my feet. But instead of falling, I found myself standing in the lobby again, my camera heavy around my neck, afternoon sunlight slanting through grimy windows. The guest registry lay open to March 15th, 2009, and everything was exactly as it had been when I'd first arrived. Except now I knew the truth. I was both observer and observed, documenter and documented, guest and exhibition. The hotel had made me part of its collection, and I would spend eternity walking these halls, discovering the same terrible secret over and over again, my own story becoming just another scene for the next visitor to witness through doors that opened and closed of their own accord. The silence pressed against my eardrums, thick with the weight of abandoned dreams and forgotten conversations. And in that silence, I could feel something watching me from the shadows, something that had been waiting in this place far longer than any guest should. I raised my camera and took my first photograph. Story 7. The painting arrived on a Tuesday morning when the autumn rain drummed against my windows like skeletal fingers tapping impatiently. I found it leaning against my front door. No delivery notice, no return address, just my name scrawled across brown paper wrapping in handwriting I didn't recognize. My hands trembled as I carried it inside, though I told myself it was from the cold seeping through my jacket. I should have left it wrapped. The landscape revealed itself as I peeled away the paper. A meadow stretching toward distant mountains, painted in oils so fresh I could smell the linseed. A cobblestone path wound through tall grass, disappearing into a grove of twisted oaks, whose branches seemed to writhe even in the stillness of the canvas. The sky bore the sickly yellow-green of an approaching storm, and something about the light made my stomach clench with unease. I hung it in my living room, directly across from my reading chair. The painting dominated the wall, its gilded frame catching the lamplight in ways that made the shadows within seem to shift and breathe. That first night, I found myself staring at it until my eyes burned, trying to identify what felt so wrong about the peaceful scene. The path bothered me most. It curved in a way that suggested continuation beyond the frame's borders, as if the artist had captured only a fragment of a much longer journey. I caught myself wondering where it led, my gaze following its winding course until it vanished among the oak trees. The urge to trace its route with my finger was so strong I had to grip my book tighter to resist. Sleep came reluctantly that night. I dreamed of walking through tall grass, my feet finding purchase on old stones worn smooth by countless travelers. The dream felt more real than my bedroom, more substantial than the sheets twisted around my sweat-dampened body. Morning brought the first change. I noticed it during my coffee, when the early light transformed my living room into something almost cathedral-like. The path in the painting had shifted, not dramatically, but enough to make my chest tighten. Where yesterday it had curved left toward the oaks, now it bent slightly right, revealing a section I was certain hadn't been visible before. The new portion showed more cobblestones, some cracked and overgrown with moss, leading deeper into what now appeared to be a more extensive forest. My hands shook as I set down my mug. Coffee sloshed across the table, dark liquid spreading like a stain. I approached the painting on unsteady legs, my breath coming in short gasps. Up close, the brushstrokes looked undisturbed, the paint aged and cracked as if decades old. Yet I knew, with the absolute certainty that comes with impending doom, that the path had changed. I called in sick to work. The thought of leaving the painting unsupervised filled me with a panic I couldn't rationalize. What if it changed again while I was gone? What if the path moved in ways I couldn't track, leaving me lost in its progression? Throughout that day, I positioned myself in my chair with a notepad, sketching the path's exact configuration every hour. My drawings grew increasingly frantic, my hand cramping from gripping the pencil too tightly. The sketches revealed no changes during daylight hours, but something about the painting's stillness felt expectant, as if it were waiting for nightfall. That evening, I dozed fitfully in my chair rather than retreat to my bedroom. I woke to find pale moonlight streaming through my windows, transforming the painting into something luminous and alive. The path had changed again. It now curved deeper into the forest, revealing glimpses of what might have been structures among the trees, angular shadows that could have been ruins or buildings so ancient they'd become part of the landscape itself. My mouth went dry. The metallic taste of fear coated my tongue as I realized I could see further along the path than should have been possible within the painting's borders. It was as if the canvas had expanded, though the frame remained unchanged. The painted world was growing, spreading beyond its physical boundaries in ways that made my vision blur and my head pound. I began keeping detailed journals, documenting each alteration with the obsessive precision of a man watching his sanity slip away. The path revealed itself incrementally, night after night, like a slow-motion revelation. Sometimes it branched into multiple routes. Other times it narrowed to barely more than a deer trail winding between massive tree trunks, whose bark bore strange markings that hurt to look at directly. My appetite disappeared. Food turned to ash in my mouth, and my reflection in the bathroom mirror showed hollow cheeks and eyes rimmed with red. Dark circles spread beneath them like bruises, and my skin took on the waxy pallor of someone who hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. When concerned colleagues called, I told them I was fighting a persistent flu. The lie came easily. I felt diseased, infected by something that was slowly consuming me from within. The painting consumed my days and haunted my nights. I moved my sleeping bag to the living room floor, positioning it so I could watch the canvas even in darkness. Sleep became a series of micro-naps interrupted by compulsive checking. Each time I opened my eyes, I expected to find the path had advanced further, revealing more of its mysterious destination. 3 weeks after the painting's arrival, I noticed the first change to my house. It started with the wallpaper in my living room. The pattern, small blue flowers on cream background, began to fade near the painting. Not uniformly, but in patches that seemed to correspond to the painted meadow's edges. Where my wall met the canvas, the cheerful domestic pattern gave way to something that looked increasingly like weathered plaster, stained and mottled as if exposed to decades of rain and wind. My breathing became shallow and rapid. I pressed my palm against the affected wall, and the surface felt different, rougher, somehow more porous. When I pulled my hand away, my skin was dusty with something that smelled of old leaves and damp earth. The changes accelerated after that. Each morning revealed new transformations that made my heart race and my vision swim with panic. The hardwood floors began to show patches of what looked like compressed soil and scattered pebbles. The ceiling developed stains that resembled cloud formations, complete with the yellowish tinge of the painting's perpetually threatening sky. I stopped answering my phone. The outside world felt increasingly unreal, a distraction from the vital work of documenting my home's metamorphosis. I filled notebook after notebook with observations, my handwriting becoming increasingly erratic as exhaustion and terror took their toll. The words seemed to move on the page sometimes, rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. My furniture began to change too. The reading chair's upholstery faded and developed patches that looked like lichen. The coffee table's wood grain shifted, becoming more gnarled and organic, as if it were slowly returning to its forest origins. Books on my shelves grew warped and swollen, their pages yellowing and brittle, filled with text that no longer resembled the stories I remembered. The path in the painting continued its relentless progress. It had revealed an entire village now, or what remained of one. Ancient stone buildings clustered around a central square, their windows dark and empty. Streets branched out in all directions, some disappearing into tunnels that seemed to burrow deep underground. The detail was impossible, far more than any canvas could contain, yet there it was, spreading before my increasingly bloodshot eyes. I found myself standing closer and closer to the painting, my nose nearly touching the surface as I tried to peer into those shadowy windows and narrow alleyways. The paint smelled of ozone and decay, like the air before a thunderstorm mixed with the musty odor of old graves. Sometimes I thought I could hear sounds emanating from within, distant footsteps on cobblestones, the creak of ancient doors, whispers in languages I couldn't identify. My house was disappearing around me, absorbed inch by inch into the painted world. The boundaries between my living room and the meadow blurred, until I could no longer tell where reality ended and the painting began. Grass sprouted through cracks in my floorboards. The scent of wildflowers mixed with the stale air of my increasingly tomb-like home. I woke one morning to find my feet bare and dirty, soil caked beneath my fingernails despite never leaving my house. My clothes smelled of long journeys through wild places, and there were burrs caught in my hair. The painted path now extended beyond the frame entirely, its cobblestones emerging from the canvas to merge seamlessly with my transformed floor. The village in the painting was no longer empty. Figures moved through its streets, distant and indistinct, but undeniably present. They seemed to pause at windows and doorways, turning toward me with faces I couldn't quite make out but somehow recognized. The sensation of being watched became constant, a weight pressing down on my shoulders and crawling along my spine like cold fingers. I tried to leave once. My hand reached for the front door handle, but when I turned it, the door opened not onto my familiar street but onto the painted meadow. Tall grass swayed in a breeze that carried the sound of distant church bells and the whisper of things moving just beyond sight. The path stretched before me, its ancient stones worn smooth by countless feet, inviting me to take the first step of a journey I knew I would never complete. I slammed the door shut and backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. But I could still smell the meadow's green scent seeping beneath the door. still hear the soft rustling of grass and the almost musical sound of wind through old oak leaves. The walls of my house had become transparent, or perhaps they had simply ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Through them, I could see the painted landscape extending in all directions, an endless world of meadows and forests, villages and ruins, all connected by paths that branched and converged in patterns too complex for human understanding. I was no longer certain where I ended and the painting began. My reflection in the few remaining mirrors showed a figure growing increasingly translucent, as if I were being slowly absorbed into the canvas world, like everything else in my dissolving house. My movements left trails of color that lingered in the air, and sometimes I found my thoughts scattered across multiple locations simultaneously, standing in my living room while also walking through painted streets, existing in both places and neither. The painted figures were closer now, gathering at the edges of the village square as if waiting for something. Their faces remained obscured, but I felt their attention like heat from a fire. They gestured toward paths leading deeper into their world, inviting me to join them in whatever lay beyond the familiar landscape of meadow and forest. I understood then that the painting hadn't come to me by accident. It was a doorway, a passage between worlds that had been seeking someone like me, someone isolated enough, lonely enough, desperate enough for change to ignore the warning signs until it was too late. The figures in the village square had once stood in living rooms of their own, had once received mysterious packages and made the choice to hang impossible landscapes on their walls. As I write these final words, my notebook rests on what was once my coffee table, but now resembles a moss-covered stone altar. The pen in my hand feels increasingly substantial, while my fingers grow more translucent with each letter. My house is gone, absorbed completely into the painted world, leaving me suspended in a place that exists between reality and imagination. The path beckons with patient persistence. The village figures wait with infinite understanding. I can hear my name being called from the depths of painted streets, spoken in voices that sound like old friends welcoming me home after a long and difficult journey. I set down my pen and take my first step onto the cobblestone path. The stones feel warm beneath my feet, worn smooth by countless travelers who made this same choice before me. Behind me, the last traces of my former life fade like morning mist. Ahead lies a world of infinite paths and eternal wandering, where the only reality is painted in oils and bound by gilded frames. The figures in the village square turn toward me with faces that mirror my own, and I understand that I am home at last. Story 8. The first morning I noticed them, my coffee went cold in my trembling hands. Grooves in the sand, deeper than any animal track I'd ever seen, carved parallel lines that stretched from the water's edge to the dunes behind my cottage. Each furrow was wide enough to fit my entire boot, scored into the beach as if something massive had dragged itself across the sand in the pre-dawn darkness. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stood at my kitchen window, watching the early morning light illuminate the scarred shoreline. The patterns were too deliberate, too precise to be random. Whatever had made them possessed intelligence, purpose. The realization sent ice water through my veins, and I found myself backing away from the window, my breath fogging the glass in short, panicked bursts. I had come to Saltmere Cove seeking solitude, fleeing the suffocating noise of the city after my divorce. The isolated coastal village seemed perfect, a handful of weathered houses perched on cliffs overlooking an endless expanse of gray Atlantic. The rental cottage sat at the village's edge, close enough to the water that I could hear the waves' eternal whisper through my bedroom walls. What I hadn't expected was to find myself questioning my sanity before the first week ended. That morning, I forced myself outside to examine the marks more closely. The salty wind whipped across the beach, carrying with it a smell I couldn't identify, something organic and ancient, like low tide mixed with copper pennies. My footsteps crunched on shells and seaweed as I approached the furrows. Up close, they were even more disturbing. The sand wasn't just displaced, it was compacted, pressed down with tremendous force. Small fragments of what looked like scales glittered in the grooves, iridescent and alien under the pale sun. I knelt beside one of the tracks, my knees sinking into the cold sand. The scale fragments felt rough against my fingertips, and when I lifted one to examine it, my skin began to itch where it had touched. A wave of nausea rolled through my stomach, and I dropped the fragment, watching it disappear into the sand. The sensation lingered, a crawling feeling across my palm that made me want to scrub my hand raw. Standing, I followed the tracks toward the village. They led directly past the weathered pier where fishing boats bobbed like broken toys, their paint peeling and hulls stained with salt and time. As I walked, I became aware of eyes watching from the cottage windows. Curtains twitched as I passed, and I caught glimpses of faces, gaunt, weathered features that seemed carved from the same gray stone as the cliffs. The local general store squatted at the village center, its wooden sign hanging askew in the wind. The bell above the door released a discordant clang as I entered, and the elderly shopkeeper looked up from behind his counter with eyes the color of storm clouds. When I mentioned the tracks on the beach, his weathered face went pale, and he mumbled something about storms churning up debris before turning away to organize already neat shelves. His dismissal felt practiced, rehearsed. The way his hands shook as he handled the merchandise suggested fear rather than disinterest. I left the store with more questions than answers, and a growing certainty that the villagers knew more about the beach markings than they were willing to admit. That night, I lay in bed listening to sounds that seemed wrong for a coastal village. Beneath the familiar crash of waves, I heard what sounded like heavy breathing, rhythmic and deep, as if something enormous were sleeping just beyond my walls. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of dark water and watching eyes the size of dinner plates. I woke to find new tracks outside my cottage. These were different, smaller, more numerous, radiating out from the original furrows like spokes from a wheel. They led directly to my front door, stopping just short of the threshold. My mouth went dry as I realized that whatever had made them had been close enough to touch my windows while I slept. The paranoia began then, a constant itch between my shoulder blades that warned of unseen observation. During the day, I found myself checking the locks on my doors obsessively, testing windows that I'd already secured twice before. The village seemed different too, quieter, as if the inhabitants were holding their collective breath. When I walked to the store, conversations stopped abruptly, and I caught fragments of whispered exchanges in what sounded like an older dialect, words that predated modern English. My research into the village's history yielded troubling discoveries. The local library, housed in a cramped room above the post office, contained records dating back 3 centuries. References to the Old Compact appeared repeatedly in faded documents, along with mentions of offerings and tithes paid to She Who Rises. The language was archaic, but the implications were clear. Saltmere Cove had a history of appeasing something that lived in the deep water. The librarian, a rail-thin woman with fingers like driftwood, watched me read with increasing agitation. She finally approached, suggesting that some knowledge was better left buried, her voice barely above a whisper. When I pressed for details, she claimed the documents were fiction, stories told to frighten children. But her eyes held the same fear I'd seen in the shopkeeper's face, and she locked the historical section after I left. The tracks appeared nightly now, growing more complex and purposeful. They formed patterns around my cottage, spirals and geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. Studying them too long induced headaches and a strange disorientation, as if the sand itself were shifting beneath my feet. I began taking photographs, but the camera captured only ordinary beach sand. Whatever force created the markings existed beyond the reach of conventional documentation. Sleep became impossible. I would lie awake listening to sounds that shouldn't exist. The scrape of something massive against rock, wet breathing that seemed to come from the ocean itself. On the 5th night, I saw movement in the water, a shadow beneath the waves, too large and deliberate to be natural. It paralleled the shoreline for hours, and I swore I could feel its attention focused on my cottage like a physical weight. The village's behavior grew more pronounced. Lights began appearing in windows at strange hours, flickering in sequences that seemed too regular to be coincidental. When I ventured out during these displays, The villagers avoided eye contact entirely, hurrying past with their heads down and shoulders hunched against an invisible burden. I discovered the truth in the basement of the old church, in records the current residents had obviously forgotten existed. The documents, written in multiple hands across decades, detailed a covenant struck in 1847 after ships began disappearing in unprecedented numbers. The village had agreed to provide regular tributes in exchange for safe passage. Livestock at first, then more complex offerings involving rituals timed to specific tidal cycles. The most recent entries, dated just months before my arrival, described a growing dissatisfaction from the deep dweller. Traditional offerings were no longer sufficient. Something new was required, something fresh and unknowing. The final entry mentioned a cottage being prepared for the chosen vessel, someone who would unknowingly complete the compact through their own curiosity and investigation. My hands shook as I read, understanding flooding through me like ice water. I wasn't a random visitor. I was bait, deliberately lured to this place. Every strange occurrence, every mysterious track, had been part of an elaborate process designed to draw me deeper into their ancient arrangement. The truth hit me with such force that I doubled over, retching into the church's dusty corners. My breath came in short gasps as the implications solidified. The rental cottage had been deliberately positioned at the water's edge. The friendly real estate agent who'd contacted me out of nowhere after my divorce papers were finalized. The too reasonable rent that had seemed like a gift after months of searching. Racing back to my cottage, I began packing with frantic urgency. But as I threw clothes into my suitcase, I realized the tracks outside had changed again. Instead of leading to the ocean, they now surrounded my cottage completely, forming a perfect circle. And within that circle, the sand had taken on a different texture, darker, damper, as if the ocean floor itself were rising to meet the surface. My car keys were missing from where I'd left them on the kitchen counter. A systematic search revealed them nowhere in the cottage, though I clearly remembered placing them beside my wallet the previous evening. The landline was dead, producing only a hollow, rushing sound, like water moving through deep caverns. My cell phone showed no signal, though it had worked perfectly since my arrival. Night fell with unnatural speed, the sun seeming to plummet below the horizon rather than set gradually. From my windows, I could see lights appearing throughout the village, not the warm yellow of electric bulbs, but a cold blue-green glow that seemed to emanate from the buildings themselves. The villagers were moving through their streets, but their movements were wrong, too coordinated, as if they were all responding to the same silent signal. The breathing sound returned, closer now and unmistakably organic. It seemed to come from the ocean itself, each exhalation causing the waves to retreat further than they should, revealing expanses of seafloor that gleamed wetly in the strange light. And in that exposed sand, I could see the source of the tracks, furrows that led from depths beyond imagination, carved by something that had decided to make the journey to shore. I pressed myself against the far wall of my cottage, as far from the windows as possible, feeling my heart hammer against my ribs so hard I feared it might burst. Sweat poured down my face despite the cold, and my hands shook so violently I could barely grip the flashlight I'd found in a kitchen drawer. Through the window, something moved in the water. Not a shadow this time, but a massive form that displaced waves as it approached the shore. The breathing grew louder, accompanied by sounds I had no words for, wet sliding noises and the crack of joints larger than tree trunks. The cottage began to shake, not from wind, but from the impact of something enormous moving across the sand outside. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence that was somehow more terrifying than any sound could have been. Even the ever-present crash of waves had stopped, as if the ocean itself were holding its breath. In that silence, I heard my own heartbeat thundering in my ears and the rasp of my panicked breathing. A knock came at my door. Not the tentative rap of knuckles, but a slow, deliberate sound, something hard striking wood with measured patience. The knocking continued for exactly 13 beats, then stopped. After a moment, it resumed, the same pattern, the same deliberate rhythm. I remained frozen against the wall, every muscle in my body screaming with tension. The knocking came a third time, and with it, a voice, not quite human, speaking words in that ancient dialect I'd heard in whispered village conversations. Though I couldn't understand the language, the meaning was clear enough. An invitation, a summons, a final call to fulfill whatever compact my presence had completed. The cottage's front door began to glow with that same blue-green light I'd seen throughout the village. The wood itself seemed to become translucent, and through it, I could see a shape that defied description. Massive, fluid, ancient beyond measure, it waited with the patience of deep tides and geological time, knowing that whatever had brought me here would eventually compel me to respond. But understanding the trap meant I could also recognize its limitations. The villagers' fear, their careful avoidance of direct involvement, suggested that whatever power they'd invoked required willing participation. I could feel the compulsion working on my mind, a growing urge to open the door and accept whatever role had been assigned to me. The urge felt foreign, intrusive, like fingers made of cold water probing the inside of my skull. I fought against it, focusing on my own thoughts, my own will. The cottage shook again, and I heard the sound of wood beginning to splinter. But I also heard something else, a change in the breathing, a note of frustration, or perhaps uncertainty. The blue-green light began to flicker, and the shape beyond the door seemed less solid, more fluid. Dawn approached with agonizing slowness, but as the first gray light touched the horizon, the presence outside began to withdraw. The breathing faded, replaced gradually by the familiar sound of waves against sand. The blue-green glow disappeared from the cottage walls, and the oppressive weight that had pressed against my thoughts lifted like morning fog. I waited until full daylight before approaching the windows. The beach was empty, unmarked by any tracks. The village appeared normal, smoke rising from chimneys and boats bobbing peacefully in the harbor. But I knew the normalcy was temporary, a pause between movements in an ancient dance. My car keys lay on the kitchen counter exactly where I'd originally placed them, as if they'd never been missing. My phone showed full signal strength. Everything had been restored, but the restoration felt like a reprieve rather than a release. I packed quickly and left Saltmere Cove before noon, driving without stopping until I reached the city. But even now, months later, I find myself checking the news for reports from that stretch of coast. And sometimes when I look out at any body of water, a lake, a river, even a full bathtub, I think I can see movement in the depths, something vast and patient that has learned my scent and knows exactly where to find me when the time comes to complete what was started in that isolated village. The tracks may be gone from the beach at Saltmere Cove, but I carry their pattern with me now, carved into my memory with the same precision that something immense once used to mark the sand. And in my dreams, I still hear that ancient breathing, waiting for my return. Story 9. The silence woke me. Not the gentle rocking of the train car, not the rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks that had lulled me to sleep hours before. Just an absolute, suffocating silence that pressed against my eardrums like cotton stuffed too deep. My eyes snapped open to find the overhead lights flickering intermittently, casting erratic shadows that danced across empty seats. The train had stopped. I sat up, my spine cracking from the awkward position I'd slept in, and immediately felt the wrongness seep into my bones. The air tasted metallic, tinged with something I couldn't identify. Not quite decay, not quite smoke, but something that made my tongue feel thick and dry. My heart began its slow, heavy thump against my ribs as I scanned the empty car. Every seat that had been occupied when I dozed off now sat vacant. Personal belongings vanished as if they'd never existed at all. Through the grimy windows, a thick fog pressed against the glass like searching fingers. It wasn't the natural mist I'd seen rolling across farmland during the journey. This fog moved with purpose, swirling in patterns that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them. Beyond it, I could barely make out the outline of a station platform, its edges dissolving into the gray void. My throat constricted as I stood, legs shaking more than they should have from just waking up. The train car felt smaller somehow, the ceiling lower, the walls closer together. I told myself it was just disorientation from sleep, but my skin prickled with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. My palms were already slick with sweat as I made my way toward the door, each step echoing in the hollow space. The platform outside stretched into nothingness in both directions. Victorian-era lampposts lined the walkway, their glass globes cracked and dim, casting sickly yellow pools of light that barely penetrated the fog. The station building loomed ahead, a massive brick structure with broken windows that gaped like dead eyes. Paint peeled from its walls in long strips, revealing patches of wood underneath that had gone black with age and moisture. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but my voice seemed to die just inches from my mouth, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. The fog muffled everything, creating a cocoon of isolation that made my chest tight with claustrophobia. I could hear my own breathing, sharp and shallow, and the wet squelch of my shoes on the damp platform. As I walked toward the station building, my peripheral vision caught movement, just a flicker, like someone ducking behind one of the lampposts. My head snapped toward it, but nothing was there except the fog churning in lazy spirals. My pulse hammered in my throat as I scanned the area, waiting for another sign of movement. When none came, I forced myself to continue walking, but every nerve in my body screamed that I wasn't alone. The station's main entrance hung open, its heavy wooden door askew on rusted hinges. Inside, the waiting room stretched further than seemed possible, filled with rows of wooden benches that disappeared into darkness. A ticket window sat behind iron bars, its glass spiderwebbed with cracks. Behind it, I could see the vague outline of what might have been a person, but when I approached, I realized it was just a coat hanging on a hook, swaying slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. My skin crawled as I explored the building. Every footstep echoed strangely, as if the sound was being repeated from somewhere else. The air grew colder the deeper I went, and my breath began to mist. In one corner, I found a departure board with letters and numbers that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. They spelled out destinations I'd never heard of, with arrival times that made no sense. Some in the past, some impossibly far in the future. When I finally made my way back outside, my blood turned to ice water. The train was exactly where I'd left it, but it looked different somehow. Older. Rust streaked its sides, and the windows were fogged from the inside, as if someone had been breathing on them. As I got closer, my stomach clenched with a sick realization. The door I'd exited through was no longer there. The entire side of the car was smooth, unbroken metal. Panic clawed its way up my throat as I circled the train, searching for any way back inside. My hands shook as I ran them along the cold metal, looking for a handle, a latch, anything. But the train had become a sealed tomb. My breathing turned ragged, each intake burning my lungs as the fog seemed to press closer, reducing my world to just a few feet in any direction. That's when I saw them. Figures stood motionless in the fog, barely visible shapes that might have been people, or might have been tricks of light and shadow. They didn't move when I stared at them directly, but I could swear they shifted position when I looked away. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my fingertips as I counted them. 5, then 7, then more appearing from the gray void. I stumbled backward, my feet sliding on the wet platform, and suddenly I was running. The fog seemed to part before me and close behind, creating a tunnel through which I fled blindly. My lungs burned as I gasped for air that felt too thin, too cold. Behind me, I could hear nothing. No footsteps, no pursuit. But the silence was worse than any sound would have been. When I finally stopped, chest heaving and legs trembling, I found myself back at the train, the exact same position where I'd started. Even the door I'd been unable to find moments before was there again, hanging open like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. My mind reeled as I stared at the impossible sight. I had run in a straight line. I was certain of it. There had been no turns, no curves in the platform. Yet here I was, back where I'd begun, as if the station had folded in on itself. I forced myself to board the train again, hoping against hope that it would start moving, that this nightmare would end. But as I settled into my seat, the same seat where I'd awakened, I noticed something that made my blood freeze in my veins. On the window beside me, Someone had traced words in the condensation. "You can't leave." The letters were fresh, the glass still warm from whatever finger had written them. I spun around, scanning the empty car, but found nothing except row after row of vacant seats. My skin felt like it was crawling with insects as I turned back to the window. The words had changed. Now they read, "We've been waiting." A low rumble filled the car as the train lurched into motion. Relief flooded through me until I looked outside and realized we were moving backward, retracing the same route I'd just walked. The platform slid past in reverse, the station building growing larger instead of smaller. When the train finally stopped again, I was back at the exact same spot. The pattern repeated itself over and over. Sometimes I would explore different parts of the station, finding rooms filled with rotting luggage or corridors that led to dead ends. Sometimes I would see the figures in the fog more clearly, tall, thin shapes in old-fashioned clothing that stood perfectly still until I looked away. But no matter what I did, no matter which direction I went, I always ended up back at the train, back at the same seat, back at the beginning. Time became meaningless in the fog. My watch had stopped, its hands frozen at the moment I'd first awakened. I had no way of knowing if minutes or hours or days had passed. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, and thirst made my mouth feel like sandpaper. But somehow I kept going, driven by a desperate need to escape this impossible prison. The figures grew bolder with each cycle. They moved closer to the platform, close enough that I could make out their faces. Pale, gaunt features with eyes that reflected the lamplight like mirrors. They never spoke, never made a sound, but I could feel their attention like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. Sometimes I would find messages written in the dust of the station windows, always in that same neat handwriting. "Join us. Stay. You belong here." My sanity began to fray at the edges. I caught myself talking to the empty air, pleading with whatever force held me here to let me go. I searched every inch of the station for clues, for some explanation of what was happening to me. In the station master's office, I found a logbook with entries dating back decades, all in different handwritings but describing the same thing: passengers who had missed their stop, who had awakened alone on the train, who had tried again and again to leave. The final entry was in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of writing it. "Day unknown. Still trying to escape. The others are patient. They know I'll understand eventually." As I stared at the impossible words in my own hand, the truth began to dawn on me with horrible clarity. The fog wasn't keeping me here. I was keeping myself here. Some part of me, some deep, hidden corner of my mind, didn't want to leave. Maybe I had been running from something in my life, something I couldn't face. Maybe the train had offered me the perfect escape, and now I was trapped in my own desire to disappear. The figures in the fog weren't threatening. They were waiting. Waiting for me to accept what I already knew but couldn't admit. That I belonged here, in this place between places, where time had no meaning and responsibility couldn't follow. Standing on the platform for what felt like the 100th time, I looked up at the figures surrounding me. They were closer now, close enough that I could see their faces clearly. They weren't monsters or ghosts. They were people like me, travelers who had found themselves on the wrong train at the wrong time and had chosen to stay rather than face whatever waited for them in the real world. One of them, a woman in a faded blue dress, raised her hand in what might have been a greeting or a farewell. Her lips moved, and though I heard no sound, I understood what she was saying. "Welcome home." The fog began to thin, and for the first time since I'd awakened, I could see beyond the station. There, in the distance, normal train tracks stretched toward a horizon that shimmered with the promise of daylight and life and all the messy complications I'd been trying to escape. I had a choice to make. I could board the train one more time and try to break free of this loop, force myself back into a world where I had to face my failures and fears. Or I could stay here, in this place where nothing ever changed, where the weight of existence couldn't crush me. The train whistle blew, a sound that seemed to come from very far away. The fog swirled around my ankles, and I felt the gentle pull of the platform beneath my feet. In the distance, The woman in blue smiled sadly and turned away, walking into the mist with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. I closed my eyes and made my choice. Story 10. The forest breathes differently at night. Every branch creaks with malevolent intention, every shadow harbors something that shouldn't exist, and every step forward feels like a mistake you can't undo. I learned this truth on a October evening when the moon hung like a cataract eye above the pine canopy, and my world began unraveling with each footfall on the damp forest floor. I had been walking these trails for months, seeking solitude after another crushing day at the office where my supervisor's condescending remarks echoed in my skull like tinnitus. The familiar path wound through Douglas firs and maples, past the creek that babbled its mindless litany, past the fallen log where I sometimes sat to smoke cigarettes I'd quit 3 times. But that night, something pulled me deeper into the woods than I'd ever ventured. My flashlight beam danced across bark and undergrowth, casting grotesque silhouettes that writhed and twisted with each tremor of my hand. The beam seemed weaker somehow, struggling against a darkness that felt almost solid. My breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the cold air, and each exhalation carried away a piece of warmth I couldn't afford to lose. The sound reached me first, a faint tinkling, like wind chimes made of glass, or perhaps ice cracking under pressure. My pulse quickened, that primitive alarm system engaging before my conscious mind could process the wrongness of hearing such delicate sounds in this wilderness. I paused, straining to identify the source, but the forest had fallen into that unnatural silence that precedes something terrible. 20 yards ahead, between 2 massive pines whose trunks disappeared into the canopy's black throat, something gleamed. Not the dull reflection of my flashlight off wet leaves or standing water, but a purposeful shine that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. My feet carried me forward despite every instinct screaming to turn back, to run, to pretend I'd never heard that crystalline sound or seen that impossible light. The object revealed itself gradually, like a photograph developing in chemical baths. An antique mirror, perhaps 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide, had been somehow embedded into the bark of the larger pine. Not nailed or attached, but grown into the tree as if the wood had flowed around it over decades. The frame appeared to be tarnished silver, ornately carved with patterns that hurt to look at directly, spirals that seemed to move when caught in peripheral vision, faces that might have been cherubs or demons depending on the angle of observation. My throat constricted as I approached. The mirror's surface wasn't quite right. Instead of the clear reflection I expected, it showed something darker, hazier, like looking through murky water. My flashlight beam seemed to penetrate the glass rather than bounce off it, disappearing into depths that shouldn't exist. Standing 3 feet from the mirror, I angled my flashlight downward and leaned forward. My reflection appeared slowly, emerging from that dark water-like surface. But something was wrong. Terribly, fundamentally wrong. The face looking back at me bore my features, but the expression was wrong. Where I felt confusion and growing dread, my reflection wore a smile. Not the pleasant expression of greeting your own image, but something predatory, something hungry. The eyes were my eyes, same brown color, same slightly asymmetrical shape from the childhood scar above my left eyebrow, but they held an intelligence that felt alien, hostile. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched my reflection raise its hand in a slow wave. I hadn't moved my own hand. I stood frozen, paralyzed by the impossibility of what I was witnessing, while my doppelganger moved independently in that dark mirror world. The reflection mouthed words I couldn't hear, but I could read the lips well enough. It was saying my name, over and over, with that predatory smile stretching wider each time. Then it pressed its palm against the glass from the inside, fingers splayed like a spider. Condensation appeared around the hand, as if the mirror surface was warm from within. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in sharp gasps that clouded the air. The forest around me seemed to lean inward, branches reaching like gnarled fingers. Every shadow contained movement, every sound carried threat. I turned and ran, crashing through undergrowth, my flashlight beam jerking wildly as tree branches tore at my jacket and face. Back home, I poured 3 fingers of bourbon and sat in my living room chair, hands shaking so violently I could barely hold the glass. Rational explanations scrolled through my mind like a desperate slideshow. Stress hallucination, some kind of funhouse mirror effect, a prank by local kids using projection technology. None of these explanations felt right, but they were better than accepting what I'd actually seen. Sleep came eventually, but it brought no relief. Dreams of that predatory smile haunted my unconscious hours, and I woke frequently with the sensation that someone was watching me from the darkened corners of my bedroom. Each time I turned on the lights, nothing was there except the ordinary furniture and shadows. But the feeling persisted. For 3 days I avoided the forest entirely. I drove different routes to work, took lunch breaks in crowded restaurants instead of walking the trails behind the office building. But the mirror called to me. In quiet moments, I found myself thinking about it with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I needed to understand what had happened, needed to prove to myself that it had been some kind of elaborate hallucination. The 4th evening found me back on the trail, equipped with a more powerful flashlight and a smartphone to record whatever I might encounter. The forest felt different this time, more aware, more alive in the wrong ways. Small animals scurried away from my approach with what seemed like unusual urgency, and birds fell silent as I passed. The mirror waited exactly where I'd left it, still embedded in the pine trunk like a cancer. This time I approached more cautiously, keeping my distance until I could observe the reflection from several angles. The surface still held that underwater quality, but my reflection appeared more quickly now, as if it had been waiting just beneath the surface. The other me looked healthier. Its skin had better color, its posture more confident. It wore my clothes, but they fit better somehow, and its hair was styled in a way I'd never managed to achieve. When our eyes met, it smiled that same predatory expression, but now there was something else there. Recognition and patience. I held up my phone to record, but the camera showed only a normal mirror reflecting my ordinary appearance. The screen displayed exactly what I should expect to see. Myself, looking haggard and frightened, holding a phone toward a mirror. But with my naked eyes, I continued to see the other version, the better version, which had begun gesturing for me to come closer. My mouth went completely dry. Sweat broke out across my forehead despite the cool evening air. The discrepancy between what the camera saw and what my eyes perceived was perhaps more terrifying than the original vision. It suggested that whatever was happening existed in a space beyond normal sensory input, beyond the ability of technology to capture or validate. The reflection pointed to something behind me, its mouth moving in urgent communication. Against every survival instinct, I turned to look over my shoulder. The forest appeared normal, trees, shadows, undergrowth lit by my flashlight beam. When I turned back to the mirror, my reflection was shaking its head in apparent frustration. It pointed again, more insistently, and mouthed words that looked like "behind you," or possibly "your time." I spun around again, this time sweeping my flashlight in a wide arc. Still nothing. But when I faced the mirror once more, my reflection had moved closer to the glass surface. Its hand was pressed against the inside surface again, but now I could see its breath fogging the glass from within. The impossible physics of this made my vision blur with vertigo. That night I researched everything I could find about mirrors, optical illusions, psychological conditions that might cause such vivid hallucinations. The internet offered countless explanations, from Charles Bonnet syndrome to temporal lobe epilepsy, but none quite matched my experience. I also found folklore about cursed mirrors, objects that could show other worlds or trap souls, but these seemed like desperate grasping at supernatural straws. The 5th night, I returned with a different strategy. I brought a small mirror from my bathroom medicine cabinet, planning to compare reflections and understand if the phenomenon was localized to the forest mirror or something happening to my perception generally. This precaution proved to be both wise and terrifying. My handheld mirror showed my normal reflection, tired, anxious, but fundamentally myself. The forest mirror continued to show the other version, which seemed to be growing more distinct and solid with each visit. Tonight it was wearing different clothes, a navy sweater I owned but rarely wore. More disturbing, it had somehow acquired a small scar on its forehead that I didn't possess. The other me gestured toward the handheld mirror I was holding, then pointed to itself. The meaning seemed clear, though I couldn't understand the mechanics. It wanted me to touch my mirror to the large mirror. The request felt like the worst possible idea, but the compulsion was growing stronger each night. The other me was no longer just smiling, it was pleading, its expressions cycling through frustration, anger, and desperate need. I stepped closer, close enough that my breath fogged the surface from my side, while its breath fogged from within. Our hands approached each other, separated only by the glass surface that seemed simultaneously solid and permeable. When our palms would have touched, I felt a strange tingling, like mild electrical current. The other me pressed harder against the glass, and I could see its knuckles going white with effort. Something was happening to the barrier between us. The glass surface rippled like water, sending concentric circles radiating outward from where our hands met. The electrical sensation intensified, climbing up my arm like tiny insects beneath the skin. My reflection's mouth was moving urgently now, saying something that looked like switch or change places. I jerked my hand back as understanding hit me like cold water. This thing wasn't just showing me another version of myself, it was trying to exchange places with me. The growing distinctness, the different clothes, the accumulating scars and changes were signs that it was becoming more real, while I was becoming more like a reflection. Panic flooded my system. My heartbeat became so loud I could hear it over the forest sounds. Cold sweat soaked through my shirt, and my hands trembled so violently I nearly dropped both mirrors. The other me was no longer pleading, it was angry now, pressing both hands against the glass and mouthing what appeared to be threats or curses. I stumbled backward, putting distance between myself and the mirror, but I could still see my reflection writhing with rage. It began pounding on the glass from within, and incredibly, I could hear the impacts as dull thuds. Each strike made the mirror frame vibrate slightly in its wooden housing. Over the next several nights, I noticed changes in my own reflection in ordinary mirrors. Subtle at first, my posture seemed slightly different, my expressions unfamiliar. My bathroom mirror showed a version of myself that moved just fractionally behind my actual movements, as if there was some lag in the reflection. My bedroom mirror occasionally showed me wearing clothes I wasn't actually wearing. The forest mirror revealed more disturbing developments. My doppelganger had acquired new scars, including one on its left hand that I distinctly remembered getting in childhood, but which had somehow disappeared from my own skin. It was wearing my father's old watch, a piece I'd lost years ago, but could now see clearly on its wrist through the glass. More disturbing still, it had begun showing me things. When I arrived at the mirror each night, it would gesture for me to watch, then turn to reveal scenes playing out behind it in that dark mirror world. I saw myself at work, but this version was confident, respected. I watched this other me receiving a promotion I'd been denied 3 times. I saw it in conversations with women who seemed genuinely interested, living in a nicer apartment, driving a better car. It was showing me a better life, one where all my failures and disappointments had somehow been corrected. The temptation was becoming unbearable. Each night I stayed longer, watching these scenes of success and happiness that could allegedly be mine, if I would just touch my palm to the glass and complete whatever exchange was trying to occur. But I also noticed changes in the world around me. Coworkers began commenting that I seemed different, distant. My sister called to ask if I was feeling well because my voice had sounded strange during our last conversation. When I looked at photographs of myself, something was off about the face looking back. Familiar, but somehow not quite right. The realization came gradually, like a developing photograph revealing its true image. The exchange wasn't a simple swap. It was happening slowly, night by night, interaction by interaction. Each time I visited the mirror, each moment I spent staring into that other world, a little more of me was being drained away while something else filled the empty spaces. On the 8th night, I brought an axe. The forest seemed to resist my approach more aggressively than ever before. Branches caught at my clothes with deliberate intent. Roots seemed to shift beneath my feet to trip me, and the path itself appeared to have changed, requiring several wrong turns before I found the familiar grove. The mirror's reflection was waiting, no longer showing the other me, but displaying my own normal appearance. This was somehow more terrifying than the doppelganger. When I raised the axe, my reflection raised an identical axe. When I stepped closer to the glass, my reflection stepped closer from within. But I could see the truth now. The reflection's movements were too perfect, too synchronized. It was copying me with the mechanical precision of a true mirror image, rather than the independent actions of a separate entity. The exchange had progressed so far that I was becoming the reflection while something else was becoming me in the real world. I thought about my sister's concerned phone call, about my coworkers' comments, about the strange lag in my bathroom mirror. How long before the exchange was complete? How long before I was trapped behind the glass while something else lived my life with my face, my memories, my relationships? The axe felt heavy in my hands as I approached the mirror for what I knew would be the final time. My reflection matched my movements perfectly, raising its own axe as I raised mine. But in its eyes, my eyes, I could see something different. Not anger or predation, but resignation. Perhaps even relief. I brought the axe down with all my strength, aiming for the center of the glass surface. The impact sent shockwaves up my arms and a thunderous crash through the forest. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces that caught my flashlight beam and threw fractured light in every direction. For a moment, I saw myself reflected in each shard, hundreds of fragmented versions scattered across the forest floor. Some showed me as I was, others showed the healthier, more confident version, and still others showed stages of transformation I couldn't identify. Then the pieces began to dissolve, not breaking down, but simply fading away like ice melting in reverse. The silver frame remained embedded in the pine bark, but it now surrounded nothing but ordinary tree trunk. I struck it with the axe until it too broke apart and fell away, leaving only scarred bark and my own ragged breathing. Walking back through the forest, I felt lighter but somehow incomplete, like recovering from an illness that had taken something essential and irreplaceable. Every ordinary mirror I encountered in the following days showed me exactly what I expected to see. Myself, moving normally, without lag or strange variations. But sometimes, in peripheral vision, or in moments of distraction, I catch glimpses of something else in reflective surfaces. Not the confident, successful version from the mirror world, but something diminished, something that seems to be searching for a way back into the world of solid things and real consequences. I tell myself it's just memory, just psychological residue from a traumatic experience that I can rationalize now as some kind of stress-induced breakdown. But I've stopped looking directly into mirrors when I can avoid it, and I never walk in forests at night. Because sometimes, just sometimes, I wonder if I destroyed the right reflection. Story 11. The first book appeared on my desk at exactly 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, its leather binding still warm as if someone had been holding it moments before. I hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't seen a shadow pass between the towering shelves, yet there it sat beneath the sickly yellow glow of my reading lamp, like a malignant growth sprouting from the mahogany surface. 3 weeks earlier, I had accepted the night shift position at the Hartwell Memorial Library, desperate enough for steady income to overlook the building's obvious decay and the librarian's nervous warnings about working alone after midnight. The pay was surprisingly generous for what seemed like simple security work with clerical duties, though Mrs. Pemberton had been oddly specific about certain rules. Never venture beyond the main reading room after 1 a.m., always keep the desk lamp burning, and under no circumstances should I attempt to reshelve any books that appeared without explanation. The ancient building creaked and settled around me that first night like arthritic bones, its Victorian architecture casting twisted shadows that seemed to writhe in my peripheral vision. Dust motes danced in the lamplight, disturbed by invisible currents that made the air feel thick and oppressive. The heating system wheezed and gurgled through copper pipes hidden within the walls. creating an irregular rhythm that set my teeth on edge and made my pulse quicken without reason. But it was the silence between those sounds that truly unnerved me. In those dead spaces, I could swear I heard the whisper of turning pages, the soft scratch of pen on paper, the barely audible rustle of someone moving through the stacks. Yet whenever I raised my head from the inventory logs, scanning the shadows between the towering bookshelves, I found nothing but empty aisles stretching into darkness. The first book's title was embossed in faded gold lettering, The Account of Marcus Reed, Volume 1. My name stared back at me from the cover, and my hands began to tremble as I opened to the first page. The paper felt unnaturally smooth, almost warm to the touch, and the ink seemed to shimmer slightly in the lamplight as if it hadn't quite dried. What I read there made my throat constrict and my breathing turn shallow. The book contained a detailed account of my life from that very moment forward, written in elegant script that looked disturbingly familiar. It described how I would leave the library at dawn, stop at the corner diner for coffee and scrambled eggs, and strike up a conversation with a red-haired waitress named Sarah about her plans to move to Portland. It detailed the exact words we would exchange, her nervous laugh when I complimented her earrings, even the way she would unconsciously twist her wedding ring while speaking. My mouth went dry as I read, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. This had to be some elaborate prank, perhaps a hazing ritual for new employees. But as dawn approached and I found myself walking toward the diner, despite my intention to go straight home, a cold certainty settled in my stomach like a stone. Sarah was there, exactly as described. Red hair pulled back in a ponytail that caught the morning light. Small silver earrings shaped like leaves. A thin gold band on her left ring finger that she twisted when nervous. Our conversation unfolded word for word as the book had predicted. Her laugh pitched exactly as written, her mannerisms captured with unsettling precision. When she mentioned Portland, my voice caught in my throat, and I excused myself with shaking hands. The second book appeared 3 nights later, again materializing silently on my desk while I was focused on cataloging returns. The Account of Marcus Reed, Volume 2, contained the next week of my life in meticulous detail. A phone call from my sister about our father's arthritis, a chance encounter with my ex-girlfriend at the grocery store, even a minor fender bender that would occur on Thursday afternoon at the intersection of Maple and 3rd. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead as I read, my breathing becoming rapid and shallow. The detail was impossible, invasive, as if someone had been inside my head, documenting thoughts I hadn't yet had. It described how I would feel a sudden urge to buy lottery tickets on Wednesday, the specific numbers I would choose based on half-remembered childhood addresses, and the crushing disappointment when none of them matched the winning combination. Thursday's accident happened exactly as written. A blue Honda ran a red light, clipping my rear bumper at 3:47 p.m. The other driver, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a nervous stutter, apologized profusely while adjusting her glasses just as the book had described. My hands shook so violently I could barely write down her insurance information. And that night, I returned to the library with a growing sense of dread clawing at my chest. Each subsequent night brought another volume, another week of my future laid bare in that disturbingly familiar handwriting. The books appeared without warning, always when my attention was elsewhere, as if they materialized from the very air itself. I began to position mirrors around my desk, trying to catch sight of whoever was placing them there, but they revealed nothing except my own increasingly haggard reflection, staring back with bloodshot eyes and pale, drawn features. Sleep became elusive. Even during my few hours off, I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering what tomorrow's book would reveal. My appetite vanished, and I lost weight rapidly, my clothes hanging loose on my frame like funeral shrouds. The constant state of anticipation was eating me alive from the inside. My nervous system jangled and raw. The handwriting in the books continued to nag at me, its loops and flourishes maddeningly familiar, yet impossible to place. I spent hours comparing it to old documents in the library's archives, searching for any clue about the author's identity. Late one night, while examining a collection of donated manuscripts, I found myself unconsciously mimicking the script as I took notes. The similarity made my blood run cold, but I dismissed it as coincidence, the result of staring at the writing for too many hours. It was during my 6th week that the books began to reveal increasingly personal details, intimate moments I would experience in solitude. They described my private thoughts, my secret fears, even the dreams I would have down to the smallest detail. One volume recounted a nightmare where I was trapped in the library's basement, surrounded by shelves that stretched impossibly high into darkness, while unseen hands repeatedly placed books on my desk faster than I could read them. I woke from that exact dream in a cold sweat, my sheets soaked with perspiration and my heart racing like a trapped animal. The books also began to predict my growing paranoia, documenting how I would start checking the locks on my apartment multiple times each night, how I would become convinced that someone was following me during my daily errands. They described with clinical precision the way I would begin talking to myself, rehearsing conversations that hadn't yet occurred, practicing responses to situations that might never arise. Most disturbing of all was how the books seemed to anticipate my attempts to change the predicted future. When I deliberately chose a different route to work one evening, hoping to avoid a described encounter with a homeless man who would ask me for change, I found the next volume already accounted for my deviation. It detailed how I would take Elm Street instead of my usual path, how I would encounter the same man 3 blocks later anyway, and how our conversation would unfold identically despite the changed location. The feeling of being trapped in an invisible web tightened around me like a noose. Every decision felt predetermined, every action already scripted by an unknown author who seemed to understand my thoughts better than I understood them myself. My breathing became constantly labored, as if the air in the library had grown thick and poisonous. Strange rashes appeared on my arms and neck, angry red welts that itched incessantly and seemed to worsen whenever I tried to resist the book's predictions. During my 8th week, I began to notice changes in the library itself. Books that had been properly shelved would appear scattered on tables and floors, as if someone had been searching frantically through them during the day. The temperature would fluctuate wildly, leaving me shivering one moment and sweating the next. The building's settling sounds grew more pronounced, creating an almost rhythmic pattern that reminded me uncomfortably of someone writing with an old fountain pen. Most unnerving were the mirrors I had installed. They began to reflect strange distortions, showing movement in areas where I could see nothing with my naked eyes. Sometimes I caught glimpses of a figure hunched over a desk in the reflection, writing furiously with an antique pen. But when I spun around to look directly, I found only empty space. The handwriting samples I had been collecting began to reveal a terrible pattern. The script in the books matched historical documents spanning over a century, appearing in diaries from the 1920s, letters from the 1940s, and journal entries from every decade since. Yet it was always the same hand, unchanging and ageless, as if the same person had been writing continuously for generations. On my 59th night, I arrived at the library to find not one book but an entire stack waiting on my desk. 23 volumes of The Account of Marcus Reed, each one thick and bound in that same unsettling leather. My vision blurred as I stared at them, my pulse thundering in my ears like the drum of an approaching storm. These books contained years of my future, decades of a life already written and decided by someone else. As I reached for the first volume with trembling hands, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. There, beside the stack of books, lay an antique fountain pen, identical to the one I had glimpsed in the mirror reflections. Its silver nib was still wet with ink, and when I picked it up, it felt warm and perfectly weighted in my grip, as if it had been crafted specifically for my hand. The revelation struck me with the force of a physical blow. The familiar handwriting, the intimate knowledge of my thoughts and dreams, the way the books seemed to anticipate my every reaction. I was the author. Somehow, some version of myself was writing these accounts, documenting a future I was simultaneously living and creating. But the terrible question remained, was I the one controlling my fate, or was something else controlling the hand that held the pen? In the final volume, I found the answer that shattered what remained of my sanity. The book described this very moment, my discovery of the pen, my realization of the truth. But it also revealed something far more horrifying. I was not the first Marcus Reed. The library's records, carefully hidden in its deepest archives, contained documentation of previous night librarians, all bearing my name, all disappearing after exactly 60 nights of work. Each previous Marcus had written his own future, trapped in an endless cycle of prediction and fulfillment, until the weight of predetermined fate had driven him to flee into the darkness beyond the library's walls. But something in the building's ancient foundations, some presence that fed on the certainty of written futures, would always call forth a new Marcus Reed to take his place at the desk. The pen felt alive in my hand now, pulsing with a warmth that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. As I opened the final book to read about my own inevitable departure, I could feel the presence stirring in the shadows around me, hungry for the continuation of its century-old feast. Tomorrow night would be my 60th and final shift. According to the book, I would walk out of the library just before dawn and never return, my mind fractured by the impossibility of living a completely predetermined life. But as I sat there in the dying hours of night 59, staring at the pen that had become an extension of my own tortured soul, I realized I had one choice the books had not accounted for. I could continue writing, adding my own pages to the endless account, but I could also change the story's direction. The presence in the shadows seemed to sense my thoughts, and the temperature in the library dropped perceptibly, frost forming on the windows despite the autumn warmth outside. I opened a fresh notebook I had brought from home and began to write a different ending, one where Marcus Reed would not flee in madness, but would instead find a way to break the cycle that had trapped so many versions of himself. As I wrote, the other books began to smoke and curl at their edges, their predetermined futures dissolving as I crafted something new and uncertain. The building shuddered around me, its ancient timbers groaning in protest as if the very foundation of reality was being rewritten. The presence in the shadows pressed closer, its hunger turning to rage as I continued to write, crafting a future that was truly my own. My hand moved with increasing urgency, the pen flowing across the page like liquid fire, burning away the predetermined path and opening a doorway to genuine possibility. As dawn approached, I reached the story's climax, describing how Marcus Reed would confront the presence that had fed on predetermined futures for over a century. The shadows around me began to writhe and coalesce, taking on a shape that was part hungry darkness and part living text, words and sentences swirling through its form like a nightmare made of paper and ink. But instead of fleeing, I continued to write, documenting the confrontation as it happened, creating reality through the act of composition itself. The presence shrieked soundlessly as I wrote about its defeat, about the breaking of the cycle that had trapped it for so long. With each word, its form became less substantial, the certainty it had fed upon dissolving into the beautiful uncertainty of an unwritten future. When the sun finally rose, I closed the notebook and stood up from the desk for the last time. The antique pen crumbled to dust in my hand, and the stacks of predetermined books burst into flames that left no ash behind. The presence was gone, its hunger finally satisfied by the feast of its own destruction. I walked out of the Hartwell Memorial Library that morning with my mind intact and my future unwritten. Behind me, the building stood silent and ordinary, just another aging repository of books and knowledge. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind carries the scent of old paper and ink, I remember the weight of that pen in my hand and the terrible comfort of a future already decided. And I write my own stories now, creating possibilities instead of certainties, always grateful for the beautiful uncertainty of not knowing what comes next. Story 12. The basement workshop smelled of wood stain and decay, a combination that had become as familiar as my own sweat. Down here, surrounded by broken antiques waiting for resurrection, I could almost forget the world above existed. Almost. But today, something felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, clinging to corners with an unnatural persistence, and the fluorescent lights flickered with an irregular rhythm that made my teeth ache. I'd been running Morrison's Restoration for 12 years, hidden beneath my brownstone on East 74th Street. Clients brought me their treasures, grandfather clocks with silent hearts, Chairs that had forgotten how to hold weight, mirrors that reflected more than they should. I fixed them all, brought them back from the edge of oblivion. But what arrived that Tuesday morning in October was different. The delivery men had struggled with it, cursing under their breath as they maneuvered the wooden crate down my narrow stairs. They'd left quickly, avoiding eye contact, their hands trembling as they collected their payment. I should have paid attention to their fear. The manifest reads simply, female mannequin, circa 1920s, origin unknown. No return address, no client information. Just a cashier's check for $5,000 paperclipped to the delivery receipt. Payment for restoration work I'd never agreed to undertake. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pried open the crate. The wood was old, stained dark with age, and something else I didn't want to identify. Inside, wrapped in yellowed cloth that felt uncomfortably warm to the touch, lay the mannequin. She was beautiful in the way antiques often are, perfect in her imperfection. Her plaster face bore the subtle cracks of age, fine lines that gave her expression depth and character. Her hair, real human hair the color of autumn leaves, had been styled in finger waves that still held their shape after decades. The dress was period-appropriate silk, deep burgundy with beadwork that caught the overhead light and threw it back in fragments. But it was her pose that stopped my breath cold. She stood with one hand raised to her throat, fingers spread wide, mouth slightly open. Her eyes, glass I told myself, just glass, seemed to track my movement around the crate. The expression was one of warning, or perhaps terror. I set her up in the corner opposite my workbench, positioning her on the small wooden platform I used for larger pieces. The afternoon passed normally enough. I worked on a Victorian writing desk, losing myself in the familiar rhythm of sanding and refinishing. But I found my gaze drifting to her again and again, drawn by some inexplicable magnetism. When I locked up that evening, she stood facing the far wall, her raised hands still clutching at nothing. The next morning, my coffee grew cold in my trembling hands. She had moved. Not dramatically. Nothing so obvious as a complete change of position. But her head had turned. Instead of facing the wall, she now looked directly toward my workbench. Her hand had dropped to her side, and her mouth had closed into what could have been a slight smile. I set down my mug with exaggerated care, my pulse quickening to a staccato beat. The logical explanations tumbled through my mind. Settling, temperature changes, my own faulty memory. Old plaster shifted sometimes, heat expansion. I was working too many hours, not sleeping enough. But her glass eyes seemed to follow me as I moved around the workshop. I checked the security footage on my phone, scrolling through 8 hours of grainy black and white images. The camera faced my workbench, catching only her profile, but I could see it clearly. At 2:47 a.m., she simply turned her head. No jerky, mechanical movement, no sudden shift. She turned with the fluid grace of a living woman adjusting her position. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the phone. That afternoon brought my first client of the week, Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who collected Depression-era glassware. She wanted me to repair a serving bowl that had belonged to her grandmother. As she explained the piece's history, gesturing with arthritic hands, I found myself glancing repeatedly at the mannequin. The mannequin stood in a new pose, both hands pressed against her chest, head tilted back, eyes closed as if in prayer or ecstasy. Mrs. Henderson followed my gaze and inhaled sharply. She asked if the piece was for sale, mentioned something about its remarkable resemblance to her sister before quickly changing the subject. When she left, she walked faster than I'd ever seen her move, nearly stumbling up the stairs in her haste. 2 hours later, Mrs. Henderson called. She'd just received news that her estranged sister, living across the country, had suffered a heart attack. The sister was alive, recovering, but the timing made my stomach clench with unease. That night, I couldn't bring myself to leave the workshop. I sat at my bench, pretending to work while watching the mannequin from the corner of my eye. She remained motionless, hands still pressed to her chest, until exactly midnight. Then, with that same impossible fluidity, she shifted again. This time, She stood with arms outstretched, face turned toward the ceiling, as if embracing someone much taller than herself. I barely slept that night, dozing fitfully in the chair at my workbench. Every shadow seemed to move independently. Every creak of the old building made me jolt awake, sweat beading on my forehead. The next day brought validation and horror in equal measure. My neighbor, Mr. Castellano, stopped by around noon. He seemed unusually animated, talking rapidly about his son's surprise visit from California. The boy had shown up unannounced that morning, the first time they'd spoken in 3 years. Mr. Castellano described their reconciliation with tears in his eyes, how they'd embraced in his doorway just after midnight. The mannequin now stood with one finger pointed toward the door, her expression somehow smug. I began documenting everything, every pose, every change, every subsequent event that seemed connected. The pattern emerged quickly, undeniably. She would shift position during the night, always between 2 and 3 a.m., and within 24 hours, something would happen that matched her new pose exactly. A woman walking past my building would trip and fall in front of the same door the mannequin pointed toward. A customer would receive unexpected news while sitting in the exact chair the mannequin appeared to be looking at. The correlations were too precise, too frequent to dismiss as coincidence. I started staying late, watching for the transformations. The changes always occurred when I wasn't looking directly at her. A blink, a moment's distraction, and she would be different. My peripheral vision would catch the movement, but when I turned, she was already still, wearing her new pose like a costume. The prophetic accuracy became addictive. I found myself rearranging my schedule based on her signals, making excuses to be in specific places at specific times. When she stood with both hands covering her eyes, I avoided Central Park and later learned about a construction accident that injured several pedestrians. When she knelt with arms wrapped around her torso, I stayed home and watched from my window as food poisoning closed the restaurant next door. I was becoming dependent on her warnings, or perhaps her guidance. The distinction was becoming harder to make, but I was also becoming increasingly aware that she was changing in other ways. The cracks in her plaster face were filling themselves, smoothing into perfect skin. Her glass eyes had developed depth, gaining flecks of green and gold that shifted in different light. The rigidity of her limbs was softening into natural flexibility. Her hair grew longer, the finger waves relaxing into modern curls. Most unsettling of all, she was warming. When I accidentally brushed against her while moving a cabinet, her arm felt like flesh instead of plaster. I jerked my hand away, but the sensation lingered. Warm skin, soft and yielding. My sleep became increasingly fragmented. Every sound from the workshop below would send me creeping down the stairs to check on her. I found myself talking to her, seeking reassurance in one-sided conversations about the day's events. She never responded, but her poses seemed to acknowledge my presence. The transformation accelerated. Within a week, she looked less like an antique mannequin and more like a perfectly preserved woman from the 1920s. Her dress now fit her form exactly, as if tailored specifically for her changing body. The beadwork caught the light differently, throwing patterns across the workshop walls that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. I stopped accepting new clients. The phone rang constantly, but I let the machine take messages I never returned. Food deliveries piled up outside my door. The world above my workshop ceased to exist except as a source of the events she predicted. She began predicting increasingly personal events. When she stood with one hand pressed against the workshop's east wall, I received a call from my ex-wife, our first conversation in 2 years. When she pointed toward my tool cabinet, I found a check I'd forgotten about tucked behind a box of screws. When she mimicked typing motions, an email arrived offering me a restoration contract worth more than I'd made all year. But the predictions were becoming more specific, more intrusive. She would position herself to predict not just events, but my reactions to them. Standing with hands clasped behind her back meant I would receive disappointing news and choose not to share it with anyone. Covering her ears meant I would overhear something I shouldn't and pretend I hadn't. She was predicting my choices before I made them, my emotions before I felt them. The boundary between prophecy and control was dissolving. The night everything changed. I woke to find her standing directly beside my chair. I hadn't heard her move, hadn't sensed her approach. She simply appeared there, close enough that I could feel warmth radiating from her body. Her face, now completely human, wore an expression of profound sadness. She reached toward me with movements that were unmistakably alive. Her fingers, no longer plaster but flesh and bone, stopping just short of touching my cheek. Her lips parted, and I heard something that might have been my name whispered in a voice like autumn wind. I scrambled backward, knocking over my coffee mug and sending tools clattering to the floor. She didn't follow, but her eyes tracked my movement with unmistakable awareness. "What do you want?" I managed to ask, my voice cracking. She smiled, the first expression I'd seen that wasn't a pose, and moved back to her platform. With deliberate slowness, she arranged herself in a new position, arms crossed over her chest, head bowed, eyes closed, the posture of rest, or death, or surrender. I understood with crystalline clarity that she was showing me my future. Tomorrow I would stand exactly as she stood now. The addiction to her predictions had become a cage, and I was the one holding the key. The revelation broke something inside me. The weeks of isolation, of living according to her silent guidance, had transformed me into something as artificial as she had once been. While she gained humanity, I had been losing mine, piece by piece, until only the hollow shell of routine remained. I grabbed a hammer from my workbench, but my hands shook too violently to use it. She watched me with those increasingly human eyes, and I saw not malevolence but pity. She had never been the predator. I had made myself the prey. Instead of destroying her, I did something harder. I walked to my security system and deleted all the footage. I erased my documentation, destroyed my notes about her predictions. I forced myself to look away as she shifted into her next pose, ignoring the peripheral movement that had become my obsession. When morning came, I called Mrs. Henderson. I told her the mannequin was free to a good home, that I'd decided not to restore it after all. She arrived within an hour, her eyes bright with an enthusiasm that made my stomach twist with warning. As Mrs. Henderson's movers carried the crate up my stairs, I caught one last glimpse of the mannequin's face through the wooden slats. She looked completely human now, beautiful and terrible in her perfection. Her eyes met mine through the gaps in the wood, and her lips moved in what might have been words of gratitude or threat. The workshop feels empty now, hollow in a way that has nothing to do with the missing mannequin. I've returned to my normal routine, accepting clients, completing projects, living in the present instead of the predicted future. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself arranging my body in specific poses without conscious thought. Arms crossed, head bowed, eyes closed. And in those moments, I can almost see tomorrow spreading out before me like a map, waiting for someone else to follow its inexorable paths. I don't know what Mrs. Henderson plans to do with her. I don't want to know. But sometimes I drive past her house and see shadows moving behind the curtains in patterns that seem too purposeful, too precise. The mannequin found what she was looking for, a willing vessel for transformation. I escaped, but the knowledge of what I almost became lingers like a scar. In quiet moments, I still feel the pull of certainty, the addictive comfort of knowing what comes next. I've learned to resist it, but the temptation never fully fades. And sometimes, in my peripheral vision, I catch glimpses of poses that haven't happened yet. Story 13. The brass buttons on the elevator panel gleamed like dead eyes in the flickering fluorescent light, and I knew something was fundamentally wrong with this place the moment I pressed 3 and felt the floor beneath me shudder with an unnatural tremor that seemed to penetrate my bones. The apartment listing had been too good to be true, a spacious one-bedroom in a historic downtown building for half the market rate. The landlord, Mrs. Chen, had been evasive about the previous tenant, mumbling something about a sudden departure and family obligations. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed me the keys, and she avoided making eye contact when I asked about the building's history. I should have paid attention to these warning signs, But desperation has a way of making us blind to obvious red flags. The Meridian building stood 12 stories tall, constructed in 1928, with all the architectural grandeur of the era. Art Deco flourishes adorned the lobby, and the original brass fixtures had been meticulously maintained. My apartment was on the third floor, 3B, a corner unit with large windows that overlooked the bustling street below. For the first week, everything seemed perfectly normal. The elevator was one of those old-fashioned models with an accordion gate and polished wood paneling. It moved slowly, with mechanical groans and clicks that spoke of decades of faithful service. The button panel showed floors 1 through 12, arranged in 2 neat columns. I rode it multiple times daily without incident, pressing 3 and arriving exactly where I expected. Then came the night everything changed. I had been living there for exactly 10 days when I returned home late from work, exhausted and carrying takeout Thai food. The lobby was dimly lit by a single functioning light. The others had apparently burned out during the day. My footsteps echoed against the marble floor as I approached the elevator, fishing for my keys in my coat pocket. The elevator arrived with its usual mechanical wheeze. I stepped inside, pressed 3, and felt that strange shudder I would later come to dread. Instead of the familiar upward motion, the elevator seemed to pause, suspended in some liminal space between floors. The lights flickered once, twice, then stabilized into a sickly yellow glow that made my skin look corpse pale in the brass reflection. When the doors opened, I was not on the third floor. The hallway before me stretched impossibly long, lined with doors that hadn't been there before. The carpet was deep burgundy, so dark it appeared black in the inadequate lighting. Ornate wallpaper covered the walls, a pattern of twisted vines and thorns that seemed to writhe when glimpsed peripherally. The air tasted metallic, like copper pennies dissolved in stagnant water. My heart began hammering against my ribs as I stepped out of the elevator. The Thai food container slipped from my nerveless fingers, splattering pad Thai across the pristine carpet. Behind me, the elevator doors slid shut with a finality that made my stomach clench with panic. I pressed the call button repeatedly, but nothing happened. The brass panel remained cold and unresponsive beneath my increasingly frantic fingers. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the corridor's chill, and I could hear my own breathing, harsh and irregular in the oppressive silence. There were 7 doors along the hallway, each bearing a brass nameplate, but the names were not those of tenants. Instead, they bore single words that made my mouth go dry. Shame, guilt, betrayal, cowardice, lies, weakness, failure. The door marked shame stood slightly ajar. Against every instinct screaming at me to find another way out, I found myself drawn toward it. The gap was just wide enough to see through, and what I saw beyond made my knees buckle. It was my childhood bedroom, exactly as it had been when I was 15. The same blue wallpaper, the same desk where I used to do homework, the same bed with its ridiculous superhero sheets that I had begged my mother to replace. But this wasn't a simple recreation. Through the crack, I could see myself at 15, cowering in the corner while my father's voice thundered from downstairs. I watched my younger self press his hands over his ears, tears streaming down his face, as the sounds of breaking glass and my mother's sobs filtered through the thin walls. I remembered this night, the night I had hidden instead of going downstairs to help, the night I had chosen my own safety over my mother's. The shame hit me like a physical blow, doubling me over as if I'd been punched in the stomach. My legs trembled, and I had to lean against the wall for support. The wallpaper felt warm and slightly damp beneath my palm, like skin. I stumbled away from the door, gasping for air that tasted increasingly stale and oppressive. The hallway seemed to pulse around me, the walls breathing with a rhythm that didn't match my own frantically beating heart. I tried to convince myself this was a hallucination, some kind of stress-induced breakdown, but the sensory details were too vivid, too precise. The door marked guilt beckoned next. This time, I saw my college dorm room, and my roommate Jake's laptop sitting open on his desk. Through the crack, I watched my 20-year-old self copying Jake's computer science assignment, changing just enough words to avoid detection. Jake had trusted me, had helped me with countless other assignments, and I had repaid that trust by stealing his work when I was too lazy to do my own. He never found out, but the guilt had eaten at me for years. My hands shook as I backed away from the door. The corridor felt smaller now, the walls pressing closer. The pattern on the wallpaper had definitely changed. The thorns were longer, sharper, and they seemed to reach toward me with deliberate intent. Betrayal showed me Sarah's apartment, the night I had slept with her best friend while she was visiting her sick grandmother. I watched myself fumbling with Rachel's bra while Sarah sent me loving text messages that went unanswered. The betrayal had ended our relationship when Sarah inevitably discovered the truth, and she had never spoken to me again. Each door was a wound reopened, a carefully buried memory dragged into the sickly light of this impossible hallway. My chest felt tight, as if invisible bands were constricting around my lungs. Cold sweat soaked through my shirt, and my vision began to blur at the edges. Cowardice revealed the conference room where I had sat in silence, while my colleague Marcus was unjustly fired for a mistake I had made. I had let him take the blame rather than confess my error, preserving my own position while destroying his career. Lies showed me the hospital room where my grandmother lay dying, asking if I was proud of my life, and my response that everything was wonderful when I was actually drowning in debt and depression. Weakness displayed the gym where I had watched Tommy Morrison get beaten up by 3 older kids, doing nothing to help because I was afraid they would target me next. By the time I reached failure, my legs could barely support me. I was sobbing now, great heaving gasps that echoed off the walls. This final door showed my father's funeral, where I had been too cowardly to deliver the eulogy I had promised, leaving my grieving mother to speak instead, while I sat mute in the front pew, paralyzed by my own inadequacy. The hallway began to spin around me. The walls tilted at impossible angles, and the carpet beneath my feet felt soft and yielding, like walking on flesh. I could hear whispers now, voices that might have been my own conscience or something far worse, cataloging every moral failure, every moment of weakness, every choice that had led me to become someone I didn't recognize. I understood then what this place was, not just a supernatural phenomenon, but a reckoning. The building itself was judging me, forcing me to confront the accumulated weight of my moral compromises. The apartments weren't just living spaces. They were feeding on guilt, on shame, on the dark corners of human conscience. Mrs. Chen's trembling hands made sense now. She knew what this place did to people. The previous tenant hadn't left for family obligations. He had fled, just as I needed to flee. But as I turned back toward where the elevator should have been, I found only a solid wall. The brass call button was gone. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions now, lined with hundreds of doors, each one representing a moment of moral failure. I had convinced myself didn't matter. My breathing became shallow and rapid. The walls pressed closer, and I could feel the building's hunger, its need to feed on guilt and self-loathing. It wanted me to stay, to become another source of shame-based nourishment, trapped forever in this corridor of regret. But somewhere in my panic, I found a spark of defiance. Yes, I had made terrible choices. Yes, I had hurt people and failed to live up to my own standards. But I was still here, still breathing, still capable of change. The building fed on shame. But what if I refused to feel ashamed? I forced myself to stand straighter, despite the trembling in my legs. One by one, I approached each door again, but this time I didn't hide from what I saw. I acknowledged each failure without flinching, accepting responsibility without drowning in self-hatred. The shame was real, but it didn't define me. It was part of my past, not my prison. As I faced each memory with honest acceptance rather than cowering guilt, the doors began to close. The whispers faded. The walls stopped pressing inward. When I reached the end of the hallway, the elevator was there again, its brass buttons gleaming warmly in suddenly normal light. The call button responded to my touch, and the familiar mechanical sounds filled the air like a lullaby. I pressed 3, and this time, the elevator took me exactly where I belonged. Back in my apartment, I sat on my couch for hours, processing what had happened. The experience felt completely real, but I couldn't prove it to anyone else. More importantly, I didn't want to. Some truths are meant to be lived rather than explained. The next morning, I gave Mrs. Chen my notice. She nodded knowingly, asking no questions, and returned my security deposit without argument. As I packed my belongings, I found myself thinking not about the supernatural encounter, but about the people I had wronged over the years. I wrote letters to Sarah, to Jake, to Marcus, to my mother. I couldn't undo the past, but I could acknowledge it honestly and try to do better going forward. The building had shown me my failures, but it had also given me something unexpected, the opportunity to choose who I wanted to become. As I walked out of the Meridian building for the final time, carrying my suitcase and looking up at its imposing facade, I noticed something I had missed before. There was a 13th floor, barely visible behind the ornate cornice work. The windows were dark, but I thought I could see movement behind them, shadows of other residents who hadn't been strong enough to face their own truths. I turned away and never looked back. The building still stands downtown, still advertising apartments at impossibly low rates. Sometimes I drive by and see new tenants moving in, their faces bright with the excitement of finding such a good deal. I want to warn them, but I know they wouldn't believe me. Besides, perhaps some of them need to take that ride to the 13th floor. Perhaps they need to learn, as I did, that the heaviest chains are the ones we forge from our own guilt, and the only key that can unlock them is the courage to face ourselves without flinching. The elevator still works perfectly, Mrs. Chen assured the next tenant. It takes you exactly where you need to go. Story 14. The photograph should have been empty, just crumbling stone walls and weathered foundations beneath an overcast sky. But there, in the background near what once was the village well, stood a figure in a dark hooded cloak. I hadn't noticed anyone when I took the shot. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the camera's memory card, checking the previous photos from today's tour. The same figure appeared in 3 more shots, always at a distance, always partially obscured by shadows or ruins. Each time, it seemed to have moved closer to where I'd been standing. I've been guiding tours through the abandoned village of Millbrook for 5 years, and I thought I knew every stone, every shadow, every trick of light that could play with your eyes. But this was different. This was something that shouldn't exist. The first time I noticed the figure was 3 weeks ago. Mrs. Henderson from the Historical Society had asked me to photograph the ruins for their annual preservation report. Standard documentation work, nothing unusual about it. But when I uploaded the images that evening, there it was in the corner of a shot of the old church foundation, a dark shape that resembled a person. I convinced myself it was a trick of shadows, maybe a tree branch swaying in the wind. The ruins were full of optical illusions. Crumbling walls created pockets of darkness that could easily fool the eye. I'd seen tourists jump at their own shadows before, but the figure appeared again the next week, this time during a guided tour with a family from Connecticut. I was explaining how the village had been abandoned in 1847 after a series of unexplained incidents drove the residents away, when I instinctively snapped a few photos of the group standing near the old schoolhouse ruins. Later, reviewing the images, I found the hooded figure in the background of 2 shots, closer than before, much closer. The family hadn't mentioned seeing anyone else. When I casually asked if they'd noticed any other visitors, they assured me we'd been completely alone. The father even commented on how isolated and peaceful the place felt. My throat went dry as I stared at the photographs on my laptop screen. The figure was clear enough now that I could make out details. The way the hood fell over what should have been a face, creating an impenetrable shadow. The stillness of its posture, as if it had been standing there for hours. The way it seemed to be watching, always watching. Sleep became difficult after that. I found myself lying awake, thinking about those photos, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. During the day, I started arriving at the ruins earlier than necessary, walking the perimeter, searching for any explanation. Maybe someone was playing an elaborate prank. Maybe a homeless person had taken shelter among the ruins and was hiding whenever tours arrived. But the more I investigated, the more unsettled I became. The ruins of Millbrook sat on a hilltop, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that I could see from anywhere in the village. No one could approach without me noticing. There were no structures large enough to hide in, no underground areas where someone could take shelter. The longest wall still standing was barely 4 feet high. Yet the figure kept appearing. Last Tuesday, I brought my colleague Marcus with me to help with a corporate team-building tour. As we walked through the village layout, pointing out where the main street once ran and where families had lived their brief lives before the Exodus, I took my usual documentation photos. Marcus was professional and thorough, keeping the group engaged while I worked. That evening, I discovered the figure in 4 separate images. But this time, it wasn't alone. In the background of a shot showing the corporate group examining the blacksmith's foundation, 2 hooded figures stood among the ruins of what had been the village's small chapel. They were closer than ever before, close enough that I could see they cast no shadows despite the bright afternoon sun. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the camera. Sweat broke out across my forehead and down my back, leaving my shirt damp and clinging to my skin. My heart hammered against my ribs as if trying to escape my chest. I called Marcus immediately, my voice tight with barely controlled panic. He listened patiently as I explained what I'd been seeing, never interrupting, never suggesting I was imagining things. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment before admitting he'd felt like they were being watched during the entire tour. He described a persistent sensation of eyes on his back, particularly when they were near the chapel ruins. That night, I researched everything I could find about Millbrook's history. The village had indeed been abandoned suddenly in 1847, but the historical records were frustratingly vague about the reasons. Most sources simply stated that unexplained phenomena had driven the residents away. One newspaper account from a neighboring town mentioned that several Millbrook residents had reported seeing watchers in the mist during the weeks leading up to the Exodus. The more I read, the more my skin crawled. References to figures in dark robes appeared in multiple accounts, always described as silent observers who seemed to materialize from nowhere. One diary entry, preserved in the county historical archives, described them as guardians of unfinished business, bound to the place until their purpose is fulfilled. By Thursday, my nerves were frayed to the breaking point. Every shadow seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it. Every sound in the ruins made me spin around, heart racing, expecting to see those hooded figures watching me. The sensation of being observed had become constant, a weight pressing down on my shoulders even when I was miles away from Millbrook. Friday's tour was canceled due to rain, but I found myself driving to the ruins anyway. I needed to understand what was happening, needed to confront whatever was drawing these entities to reveal themselves in my photographs. The logical part of my mind screamed that this was madness, that I should stay away, seek help, maybe talk to a therapist about stress and hallucinations. But another part of me, a deeper, more primitive instinct, whispered that running would solve nothing. Whatever these figures wanted, they were focused on me specifically. They appeared in my photos, seemed to move closer each time I visited. Ignoring them wouldn't make them disappear. Standing in the drizzle among the broken stones, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. I would spend the night in Millbrook. I would wait for them to show themselves, face to face, without the barrier of a camera lens between us. The day passed slowly as I prepared. I told Marcus I was taking a personal day, giving no details about my plans. I gathered supplies, a powerful flashlight, extra batteries, warm clothes, water, and my camera with multiple memory cards. I also brought a voice recorder, thinking that if something happened to me, at least there might be evidence of what transpired. As sunset approached, my pulse quickened, and my palms grew slick with sweat. Every rational thought urged me to turn back, to drive home and pretend none of this had ever happened. But the compulsion to understand, to finally confront the mystery that had been consuming my thoughts, proved stronger than my fear. I parked at the base of the hill and walked up the dirt road as twilight descended. The familiar ruins looked different in the fading light, more ominous, charged with an energy I'd never noticed before. Shadows seemed deeper. Darkness pooled in corners where it shouldn't exist. I set up my makeshift camp near the center of the village, where the main crossroads had once been. From there, I could see most of the ruins, including the chapel and the well where the figure had first appeared. My breath came in short, sharp bursts as I arranged my equipment and settled in to wait. The temperature dropped rapidly after sunset. I pulled on my jacket and hat, but the cold seemed to seep into my bones regardless. It wasn't a natural chill. It was something that reached deeper, numbing me from the inside out. The silence was complete, except for my own ragged breathing and the occasional distant sound of wind through the bare trees surrounding the hilltop. Around midnight, I started hearing footsteps. They were soft, barely audible, like someone walking carefully through fallen leaves. But there were no leaves in the ruins, just bare earth and scattered stones. The sound seemed to come from different directions, first from the chapel area, then from near the old schoolhouse, then from somewhere behind me. My heart rate spiked so high I felt dizzy. I gripped the flashlight with sweaty hands but didn't turn it on, afraid of what I might see. The footsteps continued, circling my position, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always present. Then I heard breathing that wasn't my own. It was slow and deliberate, the sound of someone standing very close, watching. I could feel body heat that wasn't mine, sense a presence just beyond the reach of my vision. The hair on my arms and neck stood up despite the heavy jacket I wore. "Who's there?" The words escaped before I could stop them, my voice cracking with tension. The breathing stopped. The footsteps ceased. Even the wind seemed to die away, leaving an absolute silence that pressed against my eardrums like water. I finally forced myself to turn on the flashlight. 3 hooded figures stood in a semicircle around me, perhaps 15 feet away. They were completely motionless, hands hidden within the folds of their dark robes, faces lost in the shadow of their hoods. They might have been there for hours or materialized seconds before I illuminated them. My body went into overdrive. Adrenaline flooded my system, making my hands shake so violently I could barely hold the flashlight steady. My mouth went completely dry, and my breathing became shallow and rapid. Sweat poured down my face despite the freezing air. But they made no move toward me. They simply stood there, watching with their invisible faces, waiting for something I didn't understand. Minutes passed. My heart gradually slowed from a panicked gallop to a merely rapid beat. The figures remained perfectly still, but I began to sense something emanating from them. Not malevolence, but a kind of desperate urgency. They weren't threatening me. They were trying to communicate something. I forced myself to speak again, my voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want?" One of the figures raised a hand and pointed toward the chapel ruins. Then, moving with fluid grace that seemed to defy physical laws, all 3 began walking in that direction. They moved without sound, their robes flowing despite the absence of any wind. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, to flee down the hill and never return. But curiosity and something deeper, a recognition that this moment had been building for weeks, compelled me to follow. The chapel ruins were more extensive than the other buildings, with portions of 3 walls still standing. As I approached with my flashlight, I could see that the figures had positioned themselves around what would have been the altar area. They stood with their backs to me, facing a section of the wall where stones had been carefully arranged in a pattern I'd never noticed before. My beam illuminated carved symbols in the ancient stones, not random scratches made by weather and time, but deliberate markings that formed a kind of text. As I moved closer, studying the carvings, understanding began to dawn. These weren't just random symbols. They were names. Dozens of names, carved by hands that had worked desperately in the final days before the village's abandonment. Below each name was a date, all from late 1847, all from the final months of Millbrook's existence. And below the names and dates, scratched into the stone with obvious haste and urgency, were the words, "We remain to bear witness. We guard their memory. We wait for acknowledgement." The figures around me began to fade like morning mist touched by sunlight. But before they disappeared completely, I understood. These weren't malevolent spirits or harbingers of doom. They were the last residents of Millbrook, bound to this place not by evil or unfinished business, but by love. They were the guardians of memory, ensuring that their village and their neighbors would not be forgotten entirely. They had appeared in my photographs because I was the one person who came here regularly, who brought others to learn about this place. They had been trying to guide me to this wall, to these names, to this monument that had been hidden in plain sight for over a century and a half. As dawn broke over the ruins, I found myself alone with my discovery and a profound sense of responsibility. I spent the morning photographing every name, every date, every word carved into that memorial wall. My hands were steady now, my purpose clear. When I returned to town, I contacted the Historical Society immediately. Within a week, a team of historians and genealogists descended on Millbrook. The memorial wall became the centerpiece of a research project that would ultimately restore the names and stories of the village's final residents to the historical record. I still guide tours through Millbrook, but now I always end at the memorial wall. I tell visitors about the families who lived here, about their final desperate hope that they would be remembered. I explain how the villagers carved their names in stone before abandoning their homes, creating a monument to their existence that would outlast their physical structures. I haven't seen the hooded figures since that night, and they no longer appear in my photographs. But sometimes, on quiet afternoons when I'm alone among the ruins, I feel a presence that's no longer urgent or desperate. It's peaceful now, satisfied. The watchers have completed their vigil. The names have been acknowledged. The memory has been preserved. Their long watch is finally over. Story 15. The mountain air cut through my lungs like shattered glass, each breath a reminder that I was far from any place where screaming would matter. The trail had been marked on my map with a thin red line, but maps lie. What stretched before me was nothing more than loose scree, and the occasional cairn left by some optimistic hiker who'd probably turned back hours ago. My boots slipped against the granite, sending pebbles cascading into the void below. The sun hung low, casting everything in that particular shade of gold that meant I had maybe an hour of decent light left. I should have turned back. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to head down, but there's something about an unfinished trail that gets under your skin like a splinter, the kind that festers if you don't dig it out. That's when I saw it. The opening wasn't much. A dark slash in the rock face, maybe 6 feet high and barely wide enough for a person. Most hikers would have walked right past it, mistaken it for a shadow or a trick of the light. But I'd been exploring caves since college, and I knew the difference between a shadow and an entrance. My headlamp beam disappeared into the darkness beyond the threshold. The air that drifted out was wrong somehow. Not cold exactly, but lacking warmth in a way that made my skin crawl. It carried no scent of earth or water, no hint of the life that usually claimed these spaces. Just emptiness. I should have marked the entrance with my GPS. Should have told someone where I was going. Should have done 100 things differently. Instead, I ducked through the opening and let the mountain swallow me whole. The moment my second foot crossed the threshold, the world changed. Behind me, where sunlight and safety had been, there was nothing but solid rock. My heart hammered against my ribs as I spun around, hands scrambling across what should have been an opening. The stone was smooth, seamless, as if the entrance had never existed at all. My breathing came in short, sharp bursts that echoed strangely in the confined space. The beam of my headlamp swept frantically across the wall, searching for any crack, any indication that I wasn't trapped. But the granite was perfect, unbroken, mocking. Think, I told myself, though my thoughts felt sluggish, like moving through thick syrup. Caves don't work like this. Rock doesn't just appear. But as I stood there, sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool air, I couldn't deny what my hands were telling me. The entrance was gone. I forced myself to turn around, to face the tunnel that stretched ahead. The walls curved gently upward, smooth as glass, and my headlamp revealed nothing but more darkness. Each step forward felt like a surrender, but staying put wasn't an option. There had to be another way out. The tunnel sloped downward, and with each step, the air grew thicker, more oppressive. My breathing sounded unnaturally loud, each exhale seeming to hang in the air longer than it should. The beam of my headlamp created a small circle of reality in an ocean of black. And beyond that circle, anything could be waiting. That's when I started noticing the sounds. At first, I thought it was just the echo of my own footsteps, but the rhythm was wrong. Where my boots made sharp, decisive sounds against the stone, these were softer, more deliberate, like something was matching my pace, staying just beyond the reach of my light. I stopped. The sound stopped. My pulse thundered in my ears as I strained to listen. Nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing and the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance. When I started walking again, the soft footsteps returned, always just behind the edge of hearing. You're imagining things, I told myself, but my hand was already reaching for the backup flashlight in my pack. Caves play tricks on your mind. Everyone knows that. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and my headlamp beam struggled to find the walls. The space felt vast, though I couldn't see how vast. My light picked out formations of flowstone that curved and twisted like frozen waterfalls, their surfaces reflecting the beam back in strange patterns. And then I saw the first inscription. It was carved into a smooth section of wall, the letters deep and precise. The style was unfamiliar, not quite Roman, not quite runic, but something that seemed to combine elements of both. My archaeological training kicked in automatically, categorizing the forms and trying to place them in some historical context. But as I moved closer, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. The inscription wasn't in some ancient language, it was in English, and it was about me. The child refuses his mother's warnings about the creek behind the house. My flashlight beam wavered as my hand started to shake. I was 7 years old again, standing at the edge of Willow Creek, my mother's voice calling from the kitchen window. She'd told me a dozen times not to go near the water after the spring rains, but I'd been fascinated by the way it rushed and tumbled over the rocks. I'd fallen in, of course, spent 3 terrifying minutes being swept downstream before managing to grab onto an overhanging branch. I'd never told anyone how close I'd come to drowning that day. Impossible, I whispered, the word echoing strangely in the vast space. This is impossible. But my light was already picking out more inscriptions, scattered across the chamber walls like a manic biography written in stone. There, the time I'd cheated on my SATs. There, the night I'd left Sarah crying in her dorm room because I was too scared to commit. And there, in letters that seemed to glow with their own faint light, the accident that had ended my academic career. Each inscription was carved in the same precise style, as if the same hand had worked on them for years. Decades. The stone around the letters was smooth and worn, suggesting an age that didn't match the content. Some of the inscriptions were high on the walls, 20 feet up or more, in places no human could reach without equipment I didn't see. My legs gave out, and I found myself sitting heavily on the chamber floor, the beam of my headlamp dancing wildly as I tried to process what I was seeing. Every shameful moment, every private failure, every secret I'd buried so deep I barely remembered it myself. All of it was here, carved into living rock with the permanence of geological time. The soft footsteps were getting closer. I scrambled to my feet, spinning around with my light, but the beam revealed nothing except more inscriptions. They covered every surface now, as if they were multiplying while I watched. The letters seemed to shift and writhe in my peripheral vision, rearranging themselves into new configurations, new secrets, new shame. He tells his wife he's working late, but drives to the overlook to sit alone in his car. He counts the pills in the bottle, but always puts it back in the medicine cabinet. He dreams of disappearing so completely that no one would think to look for him. The air in the chamber had become thick as soup, each breath a struggle. My heart was racing so fast I could feel it in my throat, and a cold sweat had broken out across my entire body. The inscriptions were moving now. I was sure of it. Letters flowing like liquid across the stone, forming new words, new accusations. And then I heard the voice. It wasn't speaking to me exactly, more like narrating, describing my actions as I performed them. The voice was mine, but distant, echoing from some deep place I didn't recognize. He realizes the inscriptions are not just about his past, the voice said, its tone flat and emotionless. They're about his future. Every choice he will make, every moment of cowardice, every small betrayal is already carved here, waiting. I spun around, trying to locate the source of the voice, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The inscriptions were glowing brighter now, pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. And in that pulsing light, I could see new words forming, letters carving themselves into the stone as I watched. He will try to run now. He will search for an exit that doesn't exist. Even as the words appeared, my body was already moving, driven by a panic that overrode rational thought. I stumbled through the chamber, my light sweeping across walls that seemed to stretch higher and farther than before. Every surface was covered in inscriptions now, layers upon layers of text that told the story of a life I hadn't lived yet. He will find the second chamber. He will understand that the cave has been waiting for him specifically. The tunnel I found was narrower than the first, forcing me to hunch forward as I moved. The walls pressed close on either side, and I could feel the weight of the mountain above me like a physical presence. My breathing had become ragged, desperate, and each exhale seemed to fog the air in front of me despite the temperature. The second chamber was smaller but even more densely covered in text. Here the inscriptions were different, older somehow, though they still described my life with disturbing accuracy. They told of decisions I hadn't made yet, conversations I hadn't had, mistakes I was apparently destined to repeat. He finds his father's journal in the basement, 3 months after the funeral. He reads about the dreams his father had, about a cave that knew his name. My legs nearly gave out again. My father had died 6 months ago, and I hadn't been able to bring myself to go through his things. His house sat empty, waiting for me to find the courage to face his belongings. But according to the wall, I would find that courage. And I would find something I wasn't prepared for. The journal will mention this place. It will have a map. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight steady. The voice continued its narration, describing my growing understanding of what this place was. A recording device, perhaps. A trap. A test. The words carved themselves into existence as the voice spoke them. The stone somehow soft and malleable where the letters formed, then hard and permanent once they were complete. He begins to understand that leaving is not a matter of finding an exit. It's a matter of accepting what he is. The chamber walls seemed to be closing in, though my rational mind knew that was impossible. The inscriptions were flowing now, words streaming across the surfaces like water, rearranging themselves into new patterns, new revelations. I could see my entire life laid out in stone, past, present, and future, all equally fixed and immutable. But then, in a section of wall that had been blank just moments before, new words began to form. These were different from the others. Instead of the mechanical precision of the other inscriptions, these letters were rough, hurried, carved by someone in obvious distress. You are not trapped by the cave. You are trapped by your certainty that you are trapped. I stared at the words, my mind struggling to process their meaning. The voice had gone silent, and for the first time since entering the cave, I could hear the sound of my own thoughts clearly. The entrance didn't disappear, I realized. I just stopped believing it was there. With growing understanding, I began to examine the inscriptions more carefully. They weren't prophecies or impossible knowledge. They were patterns. The same patterns of behavior I'd been following my entire life. The same retreats into isolation, the same self-sabotage, the same convinced helplessness that had driven me to remote trails and empty caves in the first place. The cave hadn't trapped me. I'd trapped myself, just like I always did. My breathing began to slow as I followed the logic to its conclusion. If the entrance had never really disappeared, if this was all some elaborate manifestation of my own psychological patterns, then the way out wasn't hidden. It was exactly where I'd left it. I turned back toward the tunnel I'd entered through, my headlamp beam revealing the same smooth walls, the same downward slope. But now, instead of looking for an exit that had to be somewhere else, I simply walked back the way I'd come, step by step, breath by breath, refusing to believe in the impossibility of escape. The walls fell away around me, the oppressive weight of the mountain lifted, and there, exactly where it had always been, was the entrance to the cave, a simple opening in the rock face, framing a view of darkening sky and distant peaks. I stumbled out into the evening air, my legs nearly buckling as I gulped down lungfuls of clean, cold mountain air. Behind me, the cave entrance remained exactly as I'd found it. No mysterious disappearance, no ceiling stone, just a hole in the rock that anyone could walk through. But as I gathered my gear and prepared for the long hike back to my car, I found myself thinking about my father's house, about the basement I'd been avoiding, about the journal I would find there if I had the courage to look. Because some traps, I was beginning to understand, could only be escaped by walking through them, and some caves would wait forever for you to stop running from what they had to show you. The mountain wind picked up as I started down the trail, carrying with it the faint sound of stone grinding against stone. Behind me, in the depths of the cave, new inscriptions were already forming, waiting for the next visitor, waiting for the next person who needed to learn the difference between being lost and choosing to stay that way. I didn't look back.